When a Chinese woman with 3 brutal jobs and crushing debt accepts a mysterious cowboy's offer, one job that pays more than all 3 combined, she must choose between certain ruin in a town that despises her and risking everything to work alone with a stranger on a remote desert ranch. What Meilin Zhao doesn't know is that this single decision will either destroy her completely or transform her into the most powerful woman the frontier has ever seen. If you're curious how far this story travels, drop a comment with your city below and hit that like button. Now, let me take you to the brutal desert town of Blackridge, where survival is a luxury and hope is something only fools believe in. The summer sun had no mercy in Blackridge, Arizona territory. It beat down on the dusty streets like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air thick and hostile, making every breath feel like swallowing fire. The town itself seemed to crouch beneath that merciless sky, a collection of weathered buildings, false-fronted saloons, and sun-bleached storefronts that promised prosperity but delivered only survival. Blackridge was the kind of place where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card, where men came seeking gold and left with nothing but regrets, where outsiders were tolerated only as long as they were useful. And Meilin Zhao had learned exactly how useful she was expected to be. At 22, she moved through the scorching afternoon with the exhausted precision of someone who had forgotten what rest felt like. Her black hair, pulled into a tight bun at the base of her neck, gleamed in the harsh sunlight as she hurried down the boardwalk, her worn boots making soft, rapid sounds against the sun-warped wood. Her dress, a faded blue calico that had seen better years, clung to her thin frame, darkened with sweat at the small of her back and beneath her arms. She carried herself with a rigid, defensive posture, shoulders slightly hunched as if bracing against an invisible wind, her dark eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the stares that followed her like shadows. Because in Blackridge, Meilin was always watched. "There goes the China girl," a voice drawled from the shade of the general store's overhang. "Scurrying like a damn rat." Laughter rippled through the small cluster of men lounging there, tobacco-stained teeth flashing in grins that held no warmth. Meilin's jaw tightened, but she didn't slow, didn't look, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had learned that lesson in the first brutal weeks after her father died. Any response was fuel for their entertainment. Any sign of hurt was a victory they would savor and repeat. So she kept walking, her hands clenched into fists hidden in the folds of her skirt, her breathing carefully controlled despite the rage and humiliation burning in her chest like swallowed coals. The rising sun. Laundry sat at the eastern edge of town, a narrow building that smelled perpetually of lye soap and steam. Meilin pushed through the door into air so thick with moisture it felt like drowning, the heat from the massive copper boilers turning the room into something close to hell. Mrs. Kowalski, a broad-shouldered Polish woman with forearms like fence posts, looked up from the sorting table and scowled. "You're late." 3 minutes, Meilin said quietly, already moving toward the washboards. "I apologize." 3 minutes is 3 minutes. Mrs. Kowalski's accent thickened when she was angry, consonants sharp as axe blows. "You think I pay you to waltz in whenever you please? You pay me $7 a week to destroy my hands in scalding water for 12 hours a day," Meilin thought, but what she said was, "No, ma'am. It won't happen again." The older woman grunted, apparently satisfied with the submission in Meilin's voice, and returned to her sorting. Meilin took her place at the second washboard, plunging her hands into water hot enough to hurt, and began the familiar punishing rhythm: scrub, rinse, wring, repeat. The lye soap ate at her skin, leaving her fingers red and cracked, the splits at her knuckles reopening and stinging with each movement. Around her, the other laundry workers, all women, all worn down by poverty and circumstance, moved in synchronized silence, too tired for conversation, too defeated for hope. This was Meilin's first job. Noon until midnight, 6 days a week. When she finally stumbled out into the night air at 12:30, her hands were raw and bleeding, her back screaming from the endless bending and scrubbing, her head pounding from the steam and the heat. The night offered little relief. Blackridge trapped heat like a stone oven, releasing it grudgingly, and even the darkness felt oppressive and close. But Meilin couldn't go home. Not yet. The Gold Dust Saloon blazed with light and noise, piano music and rough laughter spilling out into the street like an invitation to sin. Meilin approached the back entrance, the servant's door, and slipped inside without knocking. The kitchen was chaos. Rosie, the head cook, a mountain of a black woman with a voice like thunder and hands that could break a man's nose, was simultaneously managing 3 pots on the stove while shouting orders to the hapless dishwasher. "About damn time," Rosie said when she spotted Maylene, but her tone lacked real anger. Of all the people in Blackridge, Rosie was the closest thing Maylene had to an ally. Another outsider, another woman who understood what it meant to be judged before you even opened your mouth. "Got a whole dining room full of drunks waiting on food, and I'm doing this alone like some kind of miracle worker. I'm here now." Maylene grabbed a clean apron from the hook, tying it around her waist with practiced efficiency. "What do you need?" "Everything." Rosie gestured toward the prep table. "Start on those potatoes, and wash your hands first. I don't need no blood in the food." Maylene looked down at her cracked, weeping knuckles and felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it nearly buckled her knees. But she moved to the wash basin, scrubbed her damaged hands with the harsh soap that made the cut scream with pain, dried them on a towel that came away spotted with red, and picked up the paring knife. This was her second job. 1 a.m. until 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. The hours blurred together in a haze of chopping, stirring, plating, cleaning. The kitchen heat rivaled the laundry, the work just as punishing, the pay just as meager. But Rosie didn't mock her, didn't spit when she passed, didn't look at her like she was something dirty that needed to be scraped off a boot. That alone made it bearable. "You look half dead," Rosie observed around 4 in the morning, pausing to wipe sweat from her broad face with a dish rag. "Worse than usual, even." "I'm fine." "Liar." Rosie's dark eyes were shrewd, missing nothing. "You working yourself into the grave, girl. Your daddy wouldn't want that." The mention of her father hit like a physical blow. Maylene's hand stilled on the pot she was scrubbing, her throat suddenly tight. "My father left me with $3,000 in debts, and no way to pay them except working myself into the grave, as you put it. What he wanted stopped mattering the day he died." The bitterness in her own voice startled her. She had loved her father, quiet, scholarly Wei Jiao, who had come to America chasing dreams of gold and found only backbreaking work in the mines. He had been gentle, educated, hopeful even in the face of crushing disappointment, and he had been terrible with money, generous to a fault, trusting men who saw his kindness as weakness. When the mine collapse took his leg, he couldn't work. When the medical bills piled up, he borrowed from everyone who would lend. When the infection took his life 6 months later, he left Maylene alone in a hostile town with a mountain of debt and no protection. That had been 8 months ago. 8 months of living in a nightmare, working herself past exhaustion, eating 1 meal a day, watching the debt shrink with agonizing slowness while the interest kept it growing like a malignant thing. $3,000. Rosie whistled low. "That's a fortune. That's my life." Maylene returned to her scrubbing with renewed violence. $57 a month, every month, or Thornton takes everything my father owned and throws me out of the house. I've paid back $800 so far. Only 22 more months to go. If she didn't collapse first, if she didn't get sick, if none of her employers decided they didn't need her anymore, if she was very, very lucky. When she finally left the saloon kitchen at 6:30, the sun was already climbing, the air already warming toward another brutal day. Maylene walked home through empty streets, her body moving on something beyond exhaustion, pure stubbornness keeping her upright. Her small house, barely more than a shack at the edge of town, offered little comfort. 2 rooms, a leaking roof, furniture her father had built with his own hands before the mine took his leg. She allowed herself 1 hour. 1 precious hour to collapse on her bed, close her burning eyes, and sink into something that wasn't quite sleep, more like temporary unconsciousness. When she jolted awake, her entire body screaming in protest, she made herself rise, made herself wash her face in cold water from the basin, made herself eat a piece of stale bread and a handful of dried beans. Then she walked to her third job. Mrs. Thornton's dress shop occupied prime real estate on Main Street, a pristine establishment with large windows displaying the latest fashions from San Francisco and New York. Clara Thornton was the banker's wife, a woman who wore her social position like armor and wielded her husband's power like a weapon. She was also Maylene's landlord. It was her husband who held the note on Maylene's father's debts. which meant Maylene couldn't afford to lose this job any more than she could afford to lose the others. "You're 7 minutes late," Mrs. Thornton said coldly when Maylene entered through the back door. The woman stood beside the cutting table, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair not daring to have a strand out of place, her expensive purple dress without a single wrinkle. 7 minutes of my time wasted waiting for you." "I apologize, Mrs. Thornton. It won't." "See that it doesn't." The woman's pale blue eyes were ice chips in her carefully powdered face. "I have 3 alterations that must be completed by Friday, and Mrs. Henderson's wedding dress needs the entire bodice reconstructed. You'll work through lunch." Maylene nodded, already moving toward the sewing machine. Her fingers, raw from the laundry and cut from kitchen work, ached as she threaded the needle, but she had learned to sew through pain. Her father had taught her when she was young, one of his many skills from his educated youth in China, before poverty and desperation drove him across the ocean. This job paid the best, $12 a week, but it came with the highest cost. Mrs. Thornton seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating her, in finding fault with perfect work, in making sure Maylene understood exactly how replaceable she was. "The stitching on Mrs. Palmer's hem is uneven, Mrs. Thornton announced an hour later, holding up a dress that Maylene had spent 3 hours perfecting the previous day. "Completely unacceptable. You'll redo it." Maylene examined the hem. The stitching was flawless, 16 perfect stitches per inch, invisible from the outside exactly as she'd been taught. "Mrs. Thornton, I don't see—" "Are you contradicting me?" The woman's voice could have frozen whiskey. A familiar helplessness washed over Maylene. She could see the trap clearly, agree and waste hours redoing perfect work, or argue and give Mrs. Thornton grounds to fire her. Either way, she lost. "No, ma'am," she said quietly, taking the dress. "I'll fix it immediately." Mrs. Thornton's smile was poisonous and triumphant. "See that you do. And Maylene, the bathroom needs cleaning after you finish the hem." Cleaning the bathroom wasn't part of her job, but Maylene nodded, swallowed her rage, and bent her head over the sewing machine. This was her life. This was survival. The day dragged on with vicious slowness. Maylene sewed until her vision blurred, her back screaming from hunching over the machine, her ruined fingers leaving small blood spots on the white thread that she had to carefully unpick and redo. She ate nothing. Mrs. Thornton had made good on her threat about working through lunch, and by the time 5 o'clock arrived, she was lightheaded with hunger and exhaustion. But she couldn't go home yet. She had to return to the laundry for the evening shift. The walk back across town felt like wading through mud. Every step required conscious effort. Every breath was an exercise in willpower. Maylene's vision wavered at the edges, gray spots dancing in her peripheral vision, and she had to stop twice to lean against buildings and wait for the dizziness to pass. "I can't keep doing this," she thought. "Not for the first time. Not for the 100th time. I'm going to collapse, or get sick, or make a mistake that costs me everything." But what choice did she have? The debt wouldn't forgive itself. The jobs wouldn't become easier. Blackridge wouldn't suddenly decide to treat a Chinese woman with respect and compassion. She was trapped in a slow drowning, going under by inches, and no one was coming to save her. The evening shift at the laundry passed in the same hellish routine. Scalding water, lye soap, the endless scrubbing that left her shoulders burning and her hands raw meat. Mrs. Kowalski found 3 opportunities to criticize her work, each reprimand delivered with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed wielding power over the powerless. When midnight finally arrived, Maylene could barely stand. She counted out her day's wages from the small tin box under her bed, $2.30, subtracted her food costs, 15 cents for bread, beans, and a precious potato. That left $2.15 toward the debt. $57 a month. She needed to save $57 every month. She had made $2.15 today. The math was brutal and inescapable. Even working 3 jobs, barely sleeping, barely eating, destroying her body inch by inch, she could barely keep pace with the interest on her father's debts. One missed day, one injury, one angry employer. Any of those would send her spiraling into a pit she'd never climb out of. Maylene sat on the edge of her bed, looking at her ruined hands in the dim lamplight, and felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Not hope. She had given up on hope months ago, but something fiercer, something that tasted like fury and felt like flint striking steel. She refused to die like this, refused to let Blackridge grind her into dust, refused to become another forgotten outsider who arrived with dreams and left in a pine box. If she was going to survive this, she needed something to change, something drastic. She just had no idea what that something could possibly be. The Gold Dust Saloon on Saturday night was a study in controlled chaos. Miners fresh from the hills, cowboys in from distant ranches, gamblers, drifters, and men who made their living in the gray spaces between legal and criminal, all of them crowded around tables slick with spilled whiskey, the air thick with cigar smoke, and the smell of sweat, leather, and desperation. Maylene moved through the crowd like a ghost, balancing a tray of dirty dishes as she navigated toward the kitchen. This wasn't technically her job. She was supposed to be confined to the kitchen, hidden from the customers. But two of the regular serving girls had quit after the previous weekend's brawl, and Rosie had begged her to help just for tonight. "Keep your head down, move fast, don't make eye contact," Rosie had warned. "These men get liquored up and stupid. You understand? You see trouble coming, you run straight back to this kitchen." Maylene understood. She had been understanding her entire life, understanding that her presence was tolerated but not welcomed, that her foreignness made her a target, that women like her were expected to be invisible unless someone wanted to use them for entertainment or worse. She was collecting empty glasses from a corner table when she felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched. Not the casual glances she'd grown accustomed to, but something more focused, more intent. Maylene didn't look up. She finished gathering the glasses, turned toward the kitchen, and nearly collided with a wall of a man blocking her path. Well. He was massive, well over 6 feet, with a belly that spoke of too much beer and a face that spoke of too many fights. His breath reeked of whiskey as he leaned down, invading her space with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. "Ain't you a pretty little thing? Didn't know Rosie was hiring China dolls." "Excuse me," Maylene said quietly, attempting to step around him. His hand shot out, gripping her upper arm with enough force to bruise. "Now don't be rude. I'm talking to you." The saloon's noise seemed to dim, or maybe that was just the blood rushing in Maylene's ears. She could feel eyes turning toward them, could sense the shift in the room's energy, the way violence announces itself before it arrives, the way predators recognize when prey has been cornered. "Let go of my arm." She kept her voice level, her eyes fixed on his chest rather than his face, confrontational enough to show she wasn't completely cowed, but not enough to challenge his dominance directly. "Or what?" He grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "You gonna make me, sweet thing?" "I believe the lady asked you to let go." The new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk, quiet, almost gentle, but carrying an undertone of steel that made the big man's grip loosen reflexively. Maylene pulled her arm free and stepped back, finally looking up to see who had spoken. The man sitting at the table behind them was a study in controlled stillness. He wasn't particularly large, maybe 6 feet, lean rather than bulky, but something about the way he occupied space made him seem more present than the bigger, louder men around him. He was in his early 30s, she guessed, with dark hair that needed cutting, sun-weathered skin, and eyes the color of winter sky that were currently fixed on the drunk with the unblinking focus of a hunting cat. "This ain't your business, Ward," the big man said, but his voice had lost its aggressive edge. "I'm making it my business, Fletcher." The man, Ward, hadn't moved from his chair, hadn't raised his voice, but somehow he commanded the space around him like gravity commands planets. "The lady's working. You're drunk. Go back to your table." For a moment the tableau held, Fletcher's bulk and bluster against Ward's quiet authority, Maylene frozen between them, the entire saloon watching to see which way the confrontation would tip. Then Fletcher spat on the floor, close enough to Maylene's skirt to make his contempt clear, and shambled back toward the bar, muttering curses. Maylene released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking at the man who had intervened. "I appreciate... You work here." Ward's eyes were on her now, that same focused attention that had made Fletcher back down, but without the threat. If anything, he looked curious. "In the kitchen," Maylene said. "I'm just helping tonight because..." She stopped, aware that she was explaining herself to a stranger, that her exhaustion was making her careless. "Thank you again." She turned toward the kitchen, dismissing him, but his next word stopped her. "You're Wei Zhao's daughter." Maylene turned back slowly. "You knew my father?" "I met him a few times. Good man, honest." Ward gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit for a minute." Every instinct screamed at her to refuse. She didn't know this man, didn't know his intentions, didn't trust the way he looked at her, not with lust like Fletcher, but with an intensity that was somehow more unsettling. But he had known her father, and in this entire hostile town, anyone who remembered Wei Zhao as a good man was rare enough to be remarkable. Maylin glanced toward the kitchen, saw Rosie watching with raised eyebrows, and made a decision that felt reckless and necessary in equal measure. She set down her tray and sat, perching on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to take flight. Ward studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You're working yourself to death," he said finally. 3 jobs, no sleep, eating maybe 1 meal a day. How long you think you can keep that up?" The observation was so accurate it felt like a violation. "How do you know?" "I pay attention." He took a drink from his glass, whiskey, but he sipped it like water, clearly not drunk despite the late hour. "Saw you at the laundry on Tuesday, coming out at midnight looking half dead. Saw you at the dress shop Wednesday morning, so exhausted you nearly walked into a horse. Now here, working a 4th job when you can barely stand. Why are you watching me?" Suspicion sharpened her voice, her body tensing for flight. "Because I'm curious about someone who works that hard and still can't get ahead." Ward leaned back in his chair, the movement casual, but his eyes still locked on hers. "Your father died owing money. You're trying to pay it back. But the math doesn't work, does it? You're treading water in a flood." Maylin's hands clenched in her lap. "My debts are my concern." "They are," he agreed, "but I'm going to make you an offer anyway." Everything in her went still. In her experience, offers from strange men came with prices she couldn't afford to pay. Ward seemed to read her thoughts in her face. "Not that kind of offer," he said, something like disgust crossing his features. "I'm not Fletcher. I need a housekeeper. Someone to manage my ranch house, keep it running, handle the cooking and cleaning and organization. It's hard work, long hours, but it's 1 job instead of 3. "I already have 3 jobs," Maylene said carefully. "That pay you maybe $30 a month combined if you're lucky." Ward's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel. "I'm offering 75, plus room and board, so you won't have rent or food costs." The number hit her like a physical blow. $75 a month. She could pay off her father's debts in 3 years instead of fighting a losing battle for decades. She could sleep, eat, breathe without the constant terror of financial ruin. It was too good to be true. "What's the catch?" Maylene asked bluntly. A corner of Ward's mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close. "The catch is my ranch is 15 miles outside of town. You'd be isolated. No neighbors, no other women around, just you and me and a couple of ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. Some people might talk." "People already talk," Maylene said, "about everything I do." "Fair point." Ward finished his whiskey, set the glass down with precise care. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Zhao. I need help, and I'm willing to pay well for it. But I understand this is a risk for you, trusting a stranger, living that far from town. So here's what I propose. Come out to the ranch tomorrow. Look at where you'd be living, what the work would be. If you don't like it, I'll pay you $5 for your time and you walk away. If you do, we draw up a proper contract, legal and binding, terms spelled out clear, so there's no misunderstanding." Maylene stared at him, searching his face for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty. But all she saw was patience and something that might have been respect. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire any woman in this town. Why someone Chinese, someone people already whisper about?" Ward was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because everyone I've watched in this town either breaks or becomes bitter. You're neither. You're still fighting. That tells me you've got steel in your spine, and that's what I need. Someone who won't quit when things get hard." It was the most honest answer anyone had given her in 8 months. "Tomorrow," Maylene heard herself say. "What time?" "I'll be outside the laundry at 1 o'clock. Bring anything you'd need to look at the place properly." Ward stood, dropped coins on the table for his drink, and settled his hat on his head. "And Miss Zhao, think about it carefully. This isn't a decision to make lightly." He walked out without looking back, moving through the crowd with that same quiet authority, men stepping aside without seeming to realize they were doing it. Maylene sat frozen, her mind racing. $75 a month, room and board, one job instead of three. A chance, maybe her only chance, to dig herself out of the hole her father's death had left her in. But also, isolation, vulnerability, dependence on a man she didn't know, in a place where no one would hear her if she screamed. "Girl, you better not be thinking what I think you're thinking." Rosie appeared at her elbow, voice low and urgent. "Caleb Ward is a decent man, far as I know, but that don't mean you should go off to his ranch alone." "Caleb Ward," Maylene repeated, tasting the name. "Owns the Double Bar W, 15 miles north. Keeps to himself mostly. Comes to town maybe once a month for supplies. Lost his wife 3 years back. Childbirth took her and the baby both. Been alone out there since, except for a couple of ranch hands." Rosie's face was troubled. "He's never been inappropriate with women, never caused trouble. But that don't mean you'd be safe, you understand? Men get lonely, get ideas." "And if I stay here?" Maylene met her friend's eyes. "How long before I collapse? Before I get sick and lose all 3 jobs? Before Thornton decides I've missed too many payments and throws me out?" Rosie had no answer to that. Maylene stood, picked up her tray of dirty dishes, and headed back to the kitchen. But her mind was already miles away, calculating risks, measuring chances, weighing the certainty of slow destruction against the possibility of something different. Tomorrow, at 1 o'clock. She had until then to decide if she was brave enough or desperate enough to take the risk. Maylene didn't sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed watching shadows crawl across the ceiling, her mind turning over Caleb Ward's offer like a poker player examining cards for marks. $75 a month. The number glowed in her thoughts like a distant lamp in a storm, bright enough to navigate toward, dangerous enough to lead her off a cliff. By the time dawn broke, painting her cracked walls with thin gray light, she had made her decision 3 different ways and unmade it twice that many. But when she rose and dressed in her least worn dress, still faded, still patched at the elbows, but clean, her hands were steady. Fear and desperation had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the only way forward was through the thing that terrified you most. She worked her morning shift at the dress shop in a fog, her fingers moving through alterations with mechanical precision while her thoughts churned 15 miles north. Mrs. Thornton seemed to sense her distraction and punished it with petty cruelties. A spilled box of pins that Maylene had to retrieve from the floor on hands and knees. An accusation of stealing thread that was later discovered exactly where it belonged. A docked hour of pay for imaginary tardiness. Maylene endured it all in silence, but something had shifted in her chest. The familiar helplessness had crystallized into something harder, colder. If she took Ward's offer, she would never have to bow her head to Clara Thornton again. That thought alone was worth almost any risk. At 12:30, she changed into her work dress and walked to the laundry, arriving early enough to speak with Mrs. Kowalski before Ward appeared. "I need to leave early today," Maylene said, the words feeling like broken glass in her throat. "Just this once. I'll make up the time tomorrow. Work through the night if you need." "Absolutely not." Mrs. Kowalski didn't even look up from her sorting. "You work your shift or you don't work at all." Maylene's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Kowalski, please, I'm asking for 2 hours. I've never missed a day, never been late, except those 3 minutes yesterday." And I said no. The older woman's voice was flat, final. "You think you're special? You think I should bend rules for you when I got 3 other girls who'd take your position tomorrow? You work or you leave. Your choice." The moment crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. This was what her life would be if she stayed. Endless begging for scraps of dignity. Endless submission to people who saw her as barely human. Endless grinding herself down to nothing for wages that would never be enough. "Then I leave," Maylene heard herself say. Mrs. Kowalski's head snapped up, her expression caught between shock and fury. "What did you say?" "I quit." The words tasted like freedom and terror in equal measure. "I'll collect my wages for this week and go." "You'll collect nothing." Mrs. Kowalski's face had gone red, veins standing out on her thick neck. "You quit without notice. You forfeit your pay. That's the rule." $7, a week's worth of brutal labor, lost. But Maylene found she didn't care. She was so tired of caring about every penny, every slight, every small humiliation. "Keep it," she said quietly. "Consider it payment for your kindness all these months." She walked out before the woman could respond, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Kowalski shouting something about ungrateful foreigners, but the words faded as Maylene stepped into the midday heat. What had she done? She'd just destroyed 1/3 of her income on a stranger's promise and her own desperate hope. If Ward's offer fell through, if this was all some elaborate cruelty, she'd just made her impossible situation catastrophic. But she kept walking. Ward was leaning against a wagon outside the laundry at precisely 1 o'clock, his hat pulled low against the sun. He straightened when he saw her, his winter sky eyes taking in her work dress, the small bundle she carried containing everything she owned of value: her mother's jade bracelet, her father's pocket watch, the deed to the house she was slowly losing. "You came," he said. It wasn't a question, but something in his tone suggested he hadn't been certain. "I came." Maylene stopped a careful distance away, maintaining the space of strangers. "I need to be back by midnight for my shift at the saloon." Ward's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "You didn't quit the others." "I quit the laundry 5 minutes ago," she said it matter-of-factly, refusing to acknowledge the panic fluttering in her chest. "If your offer isn't real, I've just destroyed my life. So I'd appreciate honesty right now more than politeness." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of someone else who valued directness over comfort. "My offer is real. Contract will be drawn up by Jameson, the lawyer, legal and binding. Your choice whether to sign it or burn it after you see the place." He gestured toward the wagon. "It's a rough road. You might want to sit on the blanket." The wagon bed held supplies from town: flour sacks, a new axe, coils of rope, and a folded blanket clearly placed there for her benefit. Maylene climbed up without assistance, settling herself on the blanket with her bundle clutched in her lap. Ward swung into the driver's seat with the easy grace of someone who'd spent his life on horses and wagons, gathered the reins, and clicked his tongue. The 2 draft horses leaned into their harnesses, and Blackridge began to fall away behind them. They rode in silence for the first mile. The only sounds, the creak of wheels, the rhythmic thud of hooves, and the wind moving through the scrub brush that dotted the desert landscape. The town disappeared quickly, swallowed by distance and dust, until they might have been the only 2 people in a world of sand, sage, and endless sky. "You said you met my father," Maylene said finally, her voice barely carrying over the wagon noise. "When?" Ward was quiet for a moment, his attention apparently fixed on the road. "3 times. First was about 4 years back. He was working at the mine, came into the general store same time I did. We got to talking about horses. He knew a lot about them, said he'd worked with them back in China before he came over." Maylene closed her eyes briefly. Her father had rarely spoken about his life before America, before poverty and disappointment had worn him down to a shadow of whatever he'd been. "He was a scholar," she said softly. "He taught literature and history. But there was no money in it, and my mother was sick, and someone told him about gold in California mountains, so he came. Left everything behind for a dream that never materialized. A lot of men did that." Ward's voice carried no judgment, just acknowledgement of a common story. "The second time I saw him was at the saloon. He'd been drinking, which I gathered wasn't usual for him. Talked about his daughter at the dress shop, said she had her mother's skill with a needle and his stubbornness. Said he worried about what would happen to her if he died owing money." The words hit like fists. Her father had known. He'd known he was leaving her with an impossible burden, and the knowledge had driven him to whiskey and despair. "And the third time?" 2 weeks before he died. Ward's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. "I was in town selling cattle, stopped by the doctor's office to get some medicine for one of my hands. Your father was there arguing with Doc Morrison about payment for the surgery on his leg. Said he didn't have the money, but he'd work it off somehow. He just needed time. Doc threw him out. Told him to come back when he had cash." Rage flared hot and sudden in Maylene's chest. "Morrison refused to treat him?" "Not exactly. He'd already done the surgery, but your father needed follow-up care, medicine for the infection. Doc wouldn't provide it without payment up front." Ward's jaw was tight, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested controlled anger. I gave your father $50. Told him to get the medicine, get well, pay me back when he could. Maylene stared at the back of Ward's head, something painful and complicated unfurling in her chest. He never mentioned that. Never said. She stopped, her throat closing. The $50 is part of the debt I'm paying, isn't it? Thornton's records show it. Your father paid me back $30 before he died. Ward glanced back at her briefly, his expression unreadable. The remaining $20 he signed over to Thornton as part of consolidating his debts. I didn't ask for it, didn't want it, but he insisted on accounting for every cent. So I owe you $20. You owe me nothing. Ward's voice was firm. That debt died with your father, far as I'm concerned. I'm not Thornton. I don't profit off dead men's desperation. The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid. Maylene studied the landscape, the way the terrain was slowly changing from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and juniper. The air smelled different out here, cleaner, sharper, carrying scents of sage and sun-warmed earth instead of Blackridge's persistent odor of unwashed bodies and industrial grime. Why are you really offering me this job? She asked. And don't tell me it's because I work hard. Half the women in Blackridge work themselves to death. What makes me different? Ward was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, My wife's name was Sarah. She died 3 years ago trying to give me a son. The baby died too. His voice was flat, emotionless, but his knuckles were white on the reins. After that, I couldn't keep a housekeeper. Tried 4 different women, all locals, all supposedly respectable. First one tried to seduce me within a week, figured a widower with land was a good prospect. Second one gossiped about everything she saw in my house, made up half of it for entertainment. Third stole from me. Fourth lasted 2 months. Then her husband decided he didn't like his wife working for a single man and made her quit. So you want someone without local connections. Someone who can't gossip because no one would listen anyway. Someone desperate enough to stay because they have nowhere else to go. Maylene kept her voice level, but something bitter crept into her tone. I'm convenient. You're practical, Ward corrected. And yes, the fact that you're an outsider makes things simpler. But that's not the only reason. He guided the horses around a rocky outcrop, the wagon lurching slightly. I watched you take Fletcher's abuse last night without flinching. Watched you thank me politely and try to get back to work instead of falling apart or making a scene. You've got control, discipline. Those things matter when you're isolated, when there's work to be done and no one to help if you panic or quit. And you're not worried I'll try to seduce you? The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with the accumulated bitterness of 8 months of being treated as either invisible or available. Ward actually laughed, a short, rough sound that seemed to surprise him as much as her. Miss Zhao, you look at me like I'm a puzzle you're trying to solve before it explodes. That's not the look of a woman planning seduction. Despite herself, despite everything, Maylene felt her mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile. Fair enough. They crested a rise, and the landscape opened up before them into a valley of startling beauty. Grassland rolled away toward distant mountains, interrupted by clusters of cottonwood trees that marked a creek's meandering path. Cattle grazed in scattered groups, rust-red bodies against green grass, and to the north, buildings materialized from the landscape, a house, barn, corrals, and what looked like a bunkhouse. The double-bar W. Ward let the horses slow to a walk as they descended into the valley. Creek runs year-round, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. Pastures good enough to support about 500 head, though I'm running 300 right now. Land goes all the way to those far hills, about 8,000 acres total. It's beautiful, Maylene said, and meant it. After the harsh, barren ugliness of Blackridge, this place felt like a different world. Still harsh, still demanding, but alive in a way the desert town never managed. The house, as they drew closer, revealed itself to be a solidly built structure of logs and stone, larger than she'd expected. 2 stories, a wide porch wrapping around the front, windows that actually had glass instead of oiled paper. It looked weathered, but well-maintained, the kind of place built to last generations. Ward pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. Come inside. I'll show you what the work would be. Maylene climbed down, her legs stiff from the ride, and followed him up the porch steps. The door was unlocked, Probably nothing to steal this far from town, or maybe Ward simply didn't fear theft. Inside, the house was dim and cool, a relief from the midday heat. And it was a disaster. Dishes were piled in the sink, some crusted with food that looked days old. Dust coated every surface thick enough to write in. The floor needed sweeping, the windows were filthy, and the smell of old cooking grease hung in the air like a challenge. Maylin walked through the kitchen into what appeared to be a sitting room and found more of the same. Neglect layered on neglect. The accumulated disorder of someone who lived alone and had stopped caring about domestic comfort. "I know it's bad," Ward said from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. "I keep meaning to clean, but by the time I finish outside work, I'm too tired to care about dishes." Maylin turned slowly, taking in the full scope of what he was asking. This wasn't housekeeping. This was excavation, restoration, a complete overhaul of a space that had been abandoned to entropy. "How long since you had a proper housekeeper?" 6 months, maybe 7. "And you've been living like this?" Ward shrugged, a gesture of profound indifference. "I've been living outside mostly. House is just where I sleep." Maylin moved through the rooms with the calculating eye of someone assessing a job's true scope. Kitchen needed not just cleaning, but reorganization. The pantry was chaos, supplies mixed randomly, some items probably spoiled. Sitting room needed dusting, floor scrubbing, furniture polishing. Upstairs, she climbed the narrow staircase without asking permission, revealed 3 bedrooms. One was clearly Ward's, bed unmade, clothes scattered. The other 2 were closed up, dusty, untouched. The room at the end of the hall had been a nursery once. Maylin could see the remnants, a cradle in the corner, now gathering dust, pale blue paint on the walls, a rocking chair positioned near the window. The air felt heavy here, thick with grief and abandonment. She left quickly, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Downstairs, Ward was washing his hands in the kitchen pump, scrubbing at 3 years of accumulated grime in his own house, as if suddenly seeing it through her eyes. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded. "Well?" Maylin walked to the kitchen table and ran her finger through the dust coating its surface, leaving a clean line in the gray film. This would be a full month's work just to bring it to acceptable standards. Another month to make it actually clean. After that, maintaining it would be maybe 6 hours a day, depending on how often you're here and how much you track in from outside. "That's not a no," Ward observed. "No," Maylin agreed. "It's not." She moved to the kitchen window and looked out at the valley, the distant mountains, the endless sky that seemed to stretch farther than anything in Blackridge ever had. "If I did this, I'd need my own room, the one that faces east, upstairs, door with a lock." "Done." "I'd need Sundays free, not to go to town. I don't care about that. But one day, where the work is mine to choose, not assigned." "Agreed. And I'd need the contract to specify that my employment can't be terminated without cause in 30 days' notice. I won't be left stranded 15 miles from town with no warning." Ward nodded slowly. "That's fair. Same terms for you. If you want to leave, 30 days' notice so I can find a replacement." Maylin turned to face him, her heart hammering but her voice steady. $75 a month, paid on the 1st, in cash. Room and board as discussed, plus supplies I need for the house. And one more thing. Name it. When people in town talk, and they will talk, you don't defend my reputation. You don't explain, you don't justify, you don't try to convince anyone that this arrangement is respectable. Her eyes held his, unflinching. Let them think whatever they want. I stopped caring about Blackridge's opinion of me months ago, and I won't have you trying to salvage something that was never going to exist anyway. Ward studied her for a long moment, something like understanding crossing his features. "You want to be judged on your work, not your respectability." "I want to be judged on something I can actually control." "All right," Ward extended his hand. "We have an agreement, Miss Zhao, pending the contract." Maylin looked at his outstretched hand, calloused, scarred from work, steady as the man himself. Then she reached out and shook it, her small hand disappearing into his larger one, sealing a bargain that felt both reckless and inevitable. "When can you start?" Ward asked. Maylin thought of the dress shop, of Mrs. Thornton's petty cruelties, and the satisfaction of never having to endure them again. Thought of the saloon kitchen, of Rosie's worried eyes and the endless nights of exhaustion. Thought of her tiny house in Blackridge, the debts that would follow her anywhere, the grinding poverty that would kill her by inches if she stayed. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'll work my last shift at the saloon tonight, collect my wages, and be ready at dawn." Ward nodded. "I'll have the contract drawn up this afternoon and bring it with me tomorrow. You'll want to read it carefully before you sign." "I will." Maylene took one more look around the disaster of a kitchen, mentally cataloging what needed to be done and in what order. "Do you have cleaning supplies, or will those need to be purchased?" "I have the basics. You can make a list of anything else you need." Ward moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Zhao? This life out here. It's isolated, quiet. Some people find that peaceful. Others find it suffocating. If you decide after a week or a month that you can't stand it, I won't hold you to the contract. I'd rather know early than have you miserable for years." The consideration in his words surprised her. She'd expected practicality, maybe fairness, but not this kind of thoughtfulness about her well-being. "I appreciate that, but I think you'll find I'm harder to break than I look." "I believe you." Ward settled his hat on his head and opened the door, afternoon light flooding in. "I'll drive you back to town. You'll need time to settle your affairs." The ride back felt different, still silent, but the silence was companionable now rather than wary. Maylene watched the valley disappear behind them, committing it to memory. This would be her home soon. This vast, empty, beautiful space would be where she rebuilt her life from the ruins her father's death had left. When they reached Blackridge's outskirts, Ward said, "I'll meet you at your house at dawn. Bring whatever you want to keep. Anything you need to leave behind, I'll help you arrange storage or sale." "I don't have much worth keeping." Maylene climbed down from the wagon, her bundle clutched against her chest. "Most of it's already been sold to pay debts." "Bring what matters to you anyway." Ward gathered the reins, preparing to turn the wagon. "Home should have some things that are yours, not just mine." He left before she could respond, the wagon rattling back toward the edge of town. Maylene stood in the dusty street, watching him go, and felt the weight of her decision settling over her shoulders like a yoke. She'd just agreed to live alone with a strange man, miles from anyone who might help if things went wrong, dependent entirely on his honesty and her own judgment. It was possibly the most dangerous decision she'd ever made. It was also, she realized with a clarity that felt like light breaking through clouds, the first decision in 8 months that felt like it was truly hers. She turned toward the saloon, her final shift waiting, and found Rosie in the kitchen preparing for the evening rush. "So?" Rosie demanded immediately. "You go to that ranch?" "I went. I accepted his offer. I start tomorrow." Maylene tied on her apron with hands that trembled slightly. "I'm quitting after tonight." Rosie set down her knife with a heavy thud. "Girl, are you out of your mind? You don't know this man. You don't know what he wants from you." "I know he pays $75 a month. I know that's my only chance to get out from under these debts before they kill me." Maylene met her friend's worried eyes steadily. "I know I'm probably being a fool, but I'm already a fool who's working herself to death for nothing. At least this way, I'm a fool with a chance." Rosie was quiet for a long moment, her broad face troubled. Then she sighed, a sound like wind through canyon rocks. "You're braver than I am, or crazier. Haven't decided which. Can it be both? Knowing you? Probably." Rosie pulled Maylene into a brief, fierce hug that smelled of kitchen smoke and hard work. "You get in trouble out there, you find a way to send word. I'll come get you myself if I have to steal a horse." Maylene hugged her back, this woman who had shown her the only kindness Blackridge had offered. "Thank you for everything, for treating me like a person when no one else would." "You are a person." Rosie released her, swiping at her eyes with the back of one massive hand. "Don't you let anyone ever convince you different. Not Ward, not anyone." They worked through the night together, Maylene's last shift passing in a blur of cooking and cleaning and the strange bittersweet feeling of endings. When dawn crept through the kitchen windows and her final wages were counted into her palm, $8.50, she felt something shift in her chest. This chapter was closing. Whatever came next would be different, might be better, might be worse, but it would be hers. She walked home through empty streets, her exhausted body moving on memory and stubbornness. At her small house, she packed quickly, her mother's jade bracelet, her father's pocket watch, 3 changes of clothing, her sewing kit, a small bundle of letters her mother had written her father before she died. Everything that mattered fit in one worn canvas bag. Everything else, the furniture her father had built, the few dishes, the threadbare blankets, she left. Let Thornton sell it for the debt if he wanted. She was done carrying the weight of the past. When the sun rose fully, painting Blackridge in shades of gold that almost made it beautiful, Maylene sat on her porch steps with her bag and waited. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she was making the wisest choice or the worst mistake of her life. But she knew she was choosing. After 8 months of having every choice stripped away by circumstance and debt and other people's cruelty, she was finally choosing something for herself. The sound of wagon wheels on packed earth announced Ward's arrival. He pulled up, the same 2 draft horses, the same practical wagon, but this time there was a wooden crate in the back and a look of quiet satisfaction on his weathered face. "Contract's in the crate," he said by way of greeting, "along with supplies for the house. Figured you'd want to start working immediately." "I would." Maylene stood, shouldering her bag. "But I'll read every word of that contract first." "I'd be disappointed if you didn't." Ward climbed down and took her bag, storing it carefully in the wagon bed. "Ready?" Maylene took one last look at the house where her father had died, at the town that had used and discarded her, at the life she was leaving behind like a snake shedding poisoned skin. "I'm ready." She climbed into the wagon, and Blackridge fell away behind them for the second time. But this time she wasn't coming back. The contract was waiting on the kitchen table when they arrived at the ranch, a single sheet of paper covered in neat legal script next to a pen and inkwell. Ward unhitched the horses while Maylene stood in the disaster of a kitchen she would soon be responsible for and read every word twice. The terms were exactly as discussed. $75 monthly, paid on the 1st. Room and board provided. 30 days notice required from either party for termination. Duties clearly specified: household management, cooking, cleaning, laundry, basic provisioning. A clause explicitly stating that her employment was domestic only, with no other expectations or obligations implied or permitted. That last line had been underlined. Maylene set down the contract and looked out the window at Ward, who was leading the horses toward the barn with the easy competence of a man who'd been doing such work his entire life. He could have written anything in that contract. She'd been desperate enough to sign almost anything. But he'd been fair, even protective, building in safeguards she hadn't thought to ask for. She picked up the pen, dipped it in ink, and signed her name in the careful characters her father had taught her, then again in English below it. The scratch of pen on paper felt like a door closing and another opening simultaneously. Ward returned to find her rolling up her sleeves, the signed contract placed neatly on the corner of the table. He glanced at it, nodded once, and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Your copy is in the crate, along with lye soap, brushes, vinegar for the windows, and anything else I thought you might need to start." "Then I should start." Maylene surveyed the wreckage of the kitchen with the eye of a general planning a campaign. "I'll need water heated, multiple pots if you have them. I'll get the stove going." Ward moved past her toward the cast-iron beast that dominated one wall. "Your room is the one you chose, east-facing, upstairs. I put a lock on the door this morning, keys on the dresser." Something in Maylene's chest loosened slightly at this confirmation that he'd kept his word about such a small but significant detail. "Thank you." They worked in silence for the next hour, Ward building up the fire and hauling water from the pump, while Maylene unpacked the crate of supplies and began the systematic destruction of 6 months of accumulated filth. She started with the dishes, scraping away fossilized food, scrubbing until her already damaged hands screamed in protest, organizing them by size and purpose as she dried each piece. The work was familiar, almost meditative. Her body knew this rhythm from the laundry, from the dress shop, from every exhausting job she'd ever held. But something was different here. There was no Mrs. Kowalski hovering to criticize, no Mrs. Thornton inventing faults to punish, just the work itself, clean and honest, and the quiet presence of a man who seemed content to let her establish her own systems without interference. "I need to check the north pasture," Ward said around noon, appearing in the kitchen doorway with his hat already settled. "There's bread and cheese in the pantry if you're hungry. I'll be back before dark." Then he was gone, boots thudding across the porch, and Maylene was alone in the big house for the first time. She stopped scrubbing and listened to the silence. It was profound, almost disorienting after years of Blackridge's constant noise, saloon pianos, shouting men, wagon wheels, the industrial clang of the mine. Here, there was only the creak of the house settling, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant lowing of cattle. For just a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. She was miles from anyone, completely dependent on a man she barely knew, cut off from everything familiar. If Ward turned out to be different than he seemed, if his respectability was a facade, she would have no help, no escape, no protection. Then Maylene looked down at her ruined hands, remembered the grinding exhaustion of her 3 jobs, recalled Mrs. Thornton's casual cruelties and Fletcher's whiskey-soaked breath in her face, and the panic transmuted into something harder. She had survived worse than isolation. She had endured worse than risk. And for the first time in 8 months, she was being paid what her labor was actually worth. She went back to work with renewed focus, attacking the kitchen like an enemy that needed conquering. By the time Ward returned at dusk, she had cleaned every dish, scrubbed every surface, swept and mopped the floor, and organized the chaotic pantry into something approaching rational order. The kitchen still wasn't what she'd call clean. The windows were filthy. The stove needed serious attention. The ceiling had cobwebs in the corners, but it was functional again, almost civilized. Ward stopped in the doorway, taking in the transformation with an expression Maylene couldn't quite read. "You've been busy." "I've barely started." She was washing her hands at the pump, trying to rinse away the worst of the grime. "This room alone needs another full day, but at least now I can cook without worrying about what's living in the pots." Speaking of cooking, Ward set a cloth-wrapped bundle on the now-clean table. "Brought back a hen from the coop. Figured you might want to make something other than the bread and cheese." Maylene unwrapped the bundle to find a plucked chicken, recently killed and still fresh. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since the previous night, too focused on work to remember hunger. "I'll roast it. Do you have vegetables?" "Potatoes, carrots, onions in the root cellar. I'll show you where everything is." He led her outside to the cellar entrance, a slanted door built into the side of the house. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of earth and storage. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with preserved foods, root vegetables, sacks of flour, and beans. It was more supplies than Maylene had seen in one place since before her father died, and the sight of such abundance after months of near starvation was almost overwhelming. "Take whatever you need," Ward said. "I stock up heavy before winter. Gets hard to get to town once the snow starts." Maylene filled a basket with potatoes and carrots, her mind already planning meals, calculating how to make the supplies stretch while still cooking properly. When they emerged back into the evening light, Ward lingered near the cellar door. "I eat breakfast at 5:30 before I head out to work. Dinner around 7 after I come back. Lunch I usually take with me." He spoke matter-of-factly, outlining routines. "But I'm flexible. You need to change the schedule to make the work easier. Just say so." 5:30 and 7 are fine." Maylene shifted the heavy basket to her other hip. "Should I plan meals, or do you have preferences?" "I'm not particular. Meat, bread, vegetables, anything hot and filling." Ward reached out and took the basket from her without asking, carrying it toward the house. "My wife used to say I'd eat boot leather if it was seasoned right." It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife voluntarily, and Maylene heard the careful neutrality in his voice, the tone of someone who'd learned to speak of grief without bleeding from it. She followed him inside, not sure if she should acknowledge the reference or let it pass. Was she a good cook? The question came out before she could stop it, curiosity overriding caution. Ward set the basket on the table, his expression distant. "She was learning. We married young. She was 17, I was 22. She'd grown up in town, didn't know ranch life. But she was trying." He paused, his jaw working. "She died before she got the chance to be good at any of it." The pain in those words was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Maylene recognized it, the specific ache of loss mixed with regret, the weight of all the time that would never happen. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been terrible." It was. Ward moved toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll see you at dinner." Maylene watched him go, then turned her attention to the chicken and vegetables. She worked efficiently, her hands remembering skills her mother had taught her before sickness took her, techniques her father had refined during their lean years. The chicken went into the oven surrounded by potatoes and carrots, seasoned with herbs she found in the pantry. While it cooked, she made bread dough for tomorrow, set it to rise, and tackled the disaster of the stove. When Ward returned at 7, the kitchen smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, and Maylene had set the table with 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 knives. He stopped in the doorway again, that same unreadable expression crossing his face. "Smells good," he said finally. "It's simple, but it's hot." Maylene gestured to the table. "Sit. I'll serve." They ate in awkward silence, the clink of silverware against plates the only sound. The chicken was tender, the vegetables perfectly roasted, and Maylene felt a small spark of pride watching Ward eat with the focused attention of someone who'd been living on cold beans and stale bread for too long. "This is the best meal I've had in 3 years," he said abruptly, setting down his fork. "I mean that. Thank you." Maylene felt her cheeks warm with unexpected pleasure at the compliment. "You're welcome." More silence. Then Ward said, "The hands will be back tomorrow. Thomas and Miguel. They've been moving cattle to the South Range, but they'll be here for meals starting tomorrow night. That all right?" "Of course. How many should I plan for?" 3 total, including me. They're good men, respectful, but if they give you any trouble, you tell me immediately." Maylene nodded, filing away this information. 2 ranch hands, both men, both strangers. More variables in an already uncertain situation. "I will." After dinner, Ward disappeared to the barn again, leaving Maylene to clean up and explore the rest of the house properly. Upstairs, she found her room exactly as promised. East-facing window, simple furniture, and a sturdy lock on the door with a key waiting on the dresser. She locked and unlocked it 3 times, reassured by the solid click of the mechanism. The room was spare but clean, larger than her entire house in Blackridge. A bed with a real mattress, a dresser, a washstand, a chair by the window. Maylene unpacked her meager belongings, placing her mother's jade bracelet on the dresser where morning light would find it, her father's watch beside it. The letters she tucked into the top drawer, too precious to display. Then she sat on the bed, her bed, and felt the strangeness of the moment wash over her. Yesterday she'd been grinding herself to death in Blackridge. Today she was 15 miles away in a stranger's house, gambling her survival on a man's word and her own ability to make herself indispensable. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt something closer to cautious hope. The days fell into a pattern with surprising speed. Maylene rose at 4:30, dressed, and went downstairs to start breakfast. Coffee, eggs, bacon, biscuits, hearty fuel for men who would spend the next 12 hours doing physical labor. Ward ate efficiently and left by 6, usually with a brief nod and nothing more. The ranch hands, Thomas and Miguel, appeared the next morning as promised. Weathered men in their 40s who eyed Maylene with curiosity but treated her with careful courtesy. After breakfast, Maylene attacked the house with systematic intensity. She worked through each room like a general conquering territory, scrubbing floors, washing windows, beating rugs, polishing furniture until her reflection gleamed in the wood. The work was brutal, her hands cracked and bleeding again, her back screaming by nightfall, but it was her work, done to her standards, without anyone standing over her and venting criticisms. And slowly, remarkably, the house began to transform. By the end of the first week, the downstairs was clean enough that Maylene no longer felt embarrassed by it. By the end of the second week, it was actually pleasant. Floors gleaming, windows sparkling, the smell of lemon oil and fresh bread replacing the stale odor of bachelor neglect. Ward noticed. He didn't say much. He wasn't a man who wasted words. But she caught him sometimes standing in doorways, looking at rooms that had been disaster areas and were now orderly, almost welcoming. Once she found him running his hand along the dining table she'd spent an entire day restoring, his expression distant and complicated. "Sarah picked this table," he said when he realized Maylene was watching. "Insisted on walnut instead of pine. Said we'd have it for 50 years, pass it to our children." His hand stilled on the polished surface. I'd forgotten what it looked like clean. Maylene didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just went back to kneading bread dough and let him have his moment with his memories. The ranch hands warmed to her by the third week. Thomas, a taciturn man with a gray beard and kind eyes, started leaving his boots by the door without being asked, respecting her clean floors. Miguel, younger and more talkative, began teaching her Spanish words while he ate, laughing when she mangled the pronunciations but patient with her efforts. "You are good cook, Senorita Maylene," he said one evening, finishing his second helping of stew. "My mother, she cooked like this. Makes me remember home." "Where is home?" Maylene asked, curious despite herself. "Sonora, long way south. I come here for work, send money back." He smiled, but sadness lingered in his dark eyes. "It's hard, being far from family, but necessary." "I understand," Maylene said softly, and she did. They were both outsiders here, both far from anything that felt like home, both doing what was necessary to survive. That night, after the men had left for the bunkhouse and the kitchen was clean, Ward lingered by the stove, coffee cup in hand. "They like you," he observed. "They're kind to me." Maylene wiped down the last counter, hanging the cloth to dry. "That's more than I expected." "You're easy to be kind to." Ward said it matter-of-factly, without flirtation, just an observation. "You work hard, don't complain, cook better than most women in 3 counties. They'd be fools not to appreciate you." Maylene felt that strange warmth in her chest again, the unfamiliar pleasure of being valued for her competence, rather than tolerated despite her existence. "Thank you." Ward set down his cup, his winter sky eyes studying her with that same focused intensity she'd noticed in the saloon. "You settling in all right? I know it's isolated out here." "I like the isolation," Maylene said honestly. "In town, I was always watched, always judged. Here, I can just work without worrying about who's inventing stories about me." "People in Blackridge are probably inventing stories anyway," Ward pointed out. "Chinese woman living alone with a widower on a remote ranch. They'll assume the worst." "Let them." Maylene met his gaze steadily. "I told you before, I don't care what they think. I care about paying off my debts and building a life that doesn't require me to destroy myself for pennies." Something shifted in Ward's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of shared pragmatism. "Fair enough. But if it gets to you, if people say things when you go to town—" "I won't be going to town," Maylene interrupted. "I have everything I need here. There's nothing in Blackridge I want to see again." Ward nodded slowly, accepting this. "All right, but the offer stands. You ever need to go for supplies or anything else, just say so." After he left, Maylene stood in the quiet kitchen and felt the truth of what she'd said settle into her bones. She didn't miss Blackridge, didn't miss the constant vigilance, the grinding poverty, the casual cruelty. Here, she woke to silence and went to bed with stars so bright they hurt to look at. Here, her work mattered and was recognized. Here, she could breathe without feeling like the air itself was hostile. It wasn't home, not yet, maybe never, but it was infinitely better than where she'd been. The first month's wages arrived on schedule. 75 silver dollars counted out on the kitchen table, with Ward watching to make sure she verified the amount. Maylene's hands trembled as she counted. More money than she'd held in her entire life, earned in a single month instead of scraped together from 3 brutal jobs. "It's correct," she said, her voice barely steady. "Good." Ward pushed a ledger across the table. "I'll need you to sign here, confirming receipt. Keep your own records too. Don't trust anyone's accounting but your own." Maylene signed, then carefully divided the money. $57 went into one pile, her monthly debt payment. The remaining $18 she stared at for a long moment. Surplus. Money beyond what she needed for bare survival. The concept felt foreign, almost dangerous. "You planning to bury it in the yard?" Ward asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I'm planning to save it," Maylene said firmly. "Emergency fund, in case something happens and I need to leave quickly." The amusement faded from Ward's face, replaced by something more serious. "You think you might need to leave quickly?" "I think it's wise to have options." Maylene met his eyes without flinching. "No offense to you, but I've learned not to depend entirely on anyone's goodwill." Ward was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "That's smart. Painful, but smart." He stood, heading toward the door. "I'll ride to town tomorrow to deliver your debt payment to Thornton. You want to send a letter with it, proof of payment?" "Yes. And I want a receipt from Thornton showing the new balance. I'll make sure you get it." The next evening, Ward returned with the receipt and something else, a small package wrapped in brown paper. He set both on the table where Maylene was kneading bread dough. "Receipt shows your debt is now $2,143, he said. "Thornton wasn't happy about the large payment, seemed to think you'd struggle more." Maylene wiped flour from her hands and examined the receipt carefully. The numbers matched her calculations exactly. "And the package?" "From Rosie. She asked me to bring it out to you."
Yes, size.
Maylene opened it to find a letter and a small tin of the hand salve Rosie used in the saloon kitchen. The letter was brief but warm. "Girl, I hope you're doing all right out there. Ward seems decent enough, but you be careful anyway. Use this salve. Your hands looked like raw meat last time I saw them. Come visit sometime if you can. The kitchen isn't the same without you. Your friend, Rosie." Something tight and painful lodged in Maylene's throat. She set the letter down carefully, blinking against unexpected tears. "She's a good woman," Ward said quietly. "Asks about you every time I'm in town. She was kind to me when no one else was." Maylene's voice was rough with emotion she couldn't quite control. "I should write back. I'll bring paper and a pen when I come to dinner." He did, and Maylene spent the evening composing a careful letter telling Rosie about the ranch, the work, the clean kitchen, and the mountains visible from her bedroom window. She didn't mention the loneliness that sometimes crept in during the long afternoons, or the way she still locked her door every night, or how strange it felt to be treated with basic respect. Instead, she wrote about the good things, the hopeful things, and signed it with gratitude. Ward mailed it the next time he went to town, and 2 weeks later brought back another package, cookies this time, hard molasses cookies that traveled well, and another letter full of Rosie's blunt affection and kitchen gossip. It became a pattern. Every 2 weeks, a letter. Every 2 weeks, confirmation that someone in the world besides her employer cared whether she lived or died. It was a small thing, but it mattered more than Maylene wanted to admit. The work continued, relentless and satisfying in equal measure. By the end of the second month, the entire house was clean, properly clean, the kind of clean that spoke of care and attention rather than just surface scrubbing. Maylene had established systems for everything: laundry on Mondays and Thursdays, baking on Tuesdays and Fridays, deep cleaning rotating through rooms on a schedule. The pantry was organized, the root cellar inventoried, the kitchen running with the efficiency of a well-tuned machine. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, something shifted between her and Ward. It was nothing obvious, nothing she could point to and say, "There, that's when it changed." But she noticed small things. The way he started lingering after dinner, nursing his coffee while she cleaned up, sometimes talking about the ranch, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence. The way he asked her opinion about things, should he buy more cattle? Was the fence on the east pasture worth repairing, or should he rebuild it entirely? Did she think the barn needed a new roof before winter? At first, Maylene thought he was just being polite, making conversation to fill the silence. But gradually she realized he actually wanted her input, valued her perspective. And stranger still, she found herself having opinions about ranch management despite knowing nothing about cattle or land. "The fence should be rebuilt," she said one evening, surprising herself with her certainty. "Repairs are just delaying the inevitable. Do it right now or do it badly twice." Ward looked at her with something like approval. "That's what I thought too, but Thomas said repairs would be cheaper." "Thomas is thinking about this year's costs." "You're building something meant to last." Maylene dried a plate with slow precision, thinking through the logic. "My father used to say that poverty is expensive. Buying cheap things that break forces you to buy them again and again, while buying quality once costs more up front but less over time." "Your father was a wise man." "He was a good man who made bad financial decisions," Maylene corrected gently. "But he was right about that." Ward smiled, a real smile, reaching his eyes in a way she'd never seen before. "I'll rebuild the fence." Another evening, Ward came in from a trip to town looking troubled. Maylene was making dinner, but she noticed his expression and set down her knife. "What happened?" "Ran into Fletcher at the feed store. He asked if you were keeping me warm at night." Ward's voice was carefully controlled, but anger simmered underneath. "I told him to shut his mouth before I shut it for him." Maylene felt her jaw tighten. "I told you not to defend my reputation." I wasn't defending your reputation. I was defending mine. Ward's eyes were ice-chip cold. I won't have men assuming I dishonor my employee or disrespect my wife's memory by bringing a woman out here for anything except honest work. The fierce protectiveness in his voice surprised her. She'd expected practical indifference, maybe mild concern for appearances. But this was personal, almost angry, as if Fletcher's insinuation had been a direct insult. "What did Fletcher say?" she asked. "Nothing, after I reminded him what happened the last time he disrespected a woman in my presence." Ward's mouth was a hard line. "He'll spread the story anyway, but he'll leave you out of it." "I don't care if—" "I know you don't care what they say about you," Ward interrupted, his voice gentler. "But I care what they say about you when it's based on working for me. That's my responsibility." Maylene studied him across the kitchen, this man who'd given her a chance when no one else would, who paid her fairly and treated her with respect, who was now apparently picking fights with drunk minors to protect her name from speculation she'd already told him she didn't value. "Thank you," she said finally. "Even though I told you not to." "You're welcome, even though you told me not to." They shared a look that held something new, not quite friendship, too complex for simple respect, but a recognition of each other as people who mattered, whose dignity was worth defending even when it would be easier not to. That night, lying in her locked room with moonlight streaming through the window, Maylene acknowledged something she'd been avoiding for weeks. She liked Caleb Ward, liked his quiet competence, his direct honesty, the way he commanded respect without demanding it, liked the ranch, the work, the clean simplicity of this life they were building. And that terrified her, because liking led to trusting, and trusting led to depending, and depending on anyone, especially a man, was dangerous for someone in her position. She was his employee, nothing more. He was her employer, nothing more. Any other interpretation was a path to ruin. So she locked the feeling away with the same determination she locked her door each night. And when she went downstairs the next morning to make breakfast, she was all business again, polite, efficient, distant. If Ward noticed the change, he didn't mention it. They fell back into their careful routine of employer and employee, speaking when necessary, existing in parallel rather than together. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like loss. The distance Maylene had constructed between herself and Ward lasted exactly 3 weeks before the storm destroyed it completely. It started with clouds building over the mountains in the late afternoon, dark towers that climbed toward heaven with the kind of weight that promised violence. Maylene watched them through the kitchen window while kneading bread dough, her hands working on memory while her mind calculated. She'd lived in Arizona long enough to recognize the difference between rain that nourished and rain that destroyed. This was the destroying kind. Ward came in earlier than usual, his face tight with concern. "Storm's coming in hard. I need you to help me secure the barn and get the horses into the near corral. Thomas and Miguel are bringing in the cattle from the North Range, but they won't make it back before this hits." Maylene didn't hesitate. She wiped the flour from her hands, grabbed her shawl, and followed him outside into air that had gone still and electric, the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums like a physical thing. The sky had turned the color of old bruises, purple and black and sickly green at the edges. They worked quickly, Ward directing her with crisp efficiency born of experience. She helped him move feed sacks away from potential leaks, close shutters, reinforce a loose board on the barn door. The horses sensed the coming violence and danced nervously in their stalls, whites showing around their eyes. "Get back to the house," Ward ordered when the first fat drops began to fall, heavy as thrown stones. "Make sure all the windows are secured and stay away from them once the wind picks up." Maylene ran for the house, her shawl whipping around her shoulders as the wind arrived like a slap. She'd barely made it inside when the sky opened with a roar that sounded like the world ending. Rain didn't fall. It attacked, driving horizontal against the windows with enough force to rattle glass and frames. Wind screamed around the corners of the house, finding every gap and crack, howling like something alive and furious. Lightning split the darkness in jagged scars of white light, and thunder followed so close it shook the floor beneath Maylene's feet. She moved through the house, checking windows, her heart hammering. This was beyond any storm she'd experienced in Black Ridge. This was the kind of weather that killed people, destroyed homes, erased careful human order, and replaced it with chaos. Ward crashed through the door 20 minutes later, soaked to the skin despite the short distance from the barn. Water streamed from his hair, his clothes, pooling on the floor Maylene had scrubbed that morning. "Thomas and Miguel?" she asked immediately. "Still out there." Ward's face was grim. "They've got experience with storms. They'll find shelter, but they won't make it back tonight." Another crack of thunder, close enough that Maylene flinched involuntarily. Ward moved to the window, peering out into darkness broken only by lightning flashes. "Creek's going to flood. Always does in storms like this. If it jumps the banks, we could lose the bridge." "What can we do?" "Nothing, until it passes." Ward turned away from the window, water still dripping from him. "Could be hours. You should get some dry clothes on and stay upstairs where it's safer." Maylene looked at him, soaked, worried, alone with a responsibility too large for one person, and made a decision. "I'll make coffee first, and you need dry clothes too before you catch your death." She expected argument, but Ward just nodded and headed upstairs. By the time he returned in dry pants and a flannel shirt, Maylene had coffee brewing and was lighting lamps against the darkness. The storm raged outside, turning the world beyond the windows into a nightmarish blur of water and wind. They sat at the kitchen table, coffee cups between them, and listened to nature's fury. Lightning illuminated the room in stark flashes, throwing shadows that jumped and twisted. Thunder rolled continuously, sometimes so loud it felt like the house itself was being struck. "Worst storm I've seen in 5 years," Ward said quietly. "Maybe longer." "Are Thomas and Miguel really safe out there?" "They're probably holed up in one of the line shacks. Small cabins scattered around the property for exactly this kind of situation." Ward's hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, knuckles white. "They know the land. They'll be all right." But his voice carried doubt, and Maylene heard it clearly. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it intensified, wind screaming with renewed fury, rain hammering the roof like fists demanding entry. Around midnight, a tremendous crack of thunder coincided with a lightning strike so close that the flash through the windows was blinding. The entire house shuddered, and then, with a splintering crash that cut through even the storm's roar, something gave way. Ward was on his feet instantly, grabbing a lantern. "That was the barn. Stay here. You can't go out in this." But he was already moving, pulling on his still damp coat, his face set with the grim determination of a man who would protect what was his, no matter the cost. The door slammed behind him, and Maylene was left in the kitchen watching his lantern light disappear into the maelstrom. 5 minutes passed. 10. 15. Maylene paced the kitchen, her fear building with each minute Ward didn't return. What if he was hurt? What if a tree had fallen, or the barn had collapsed on him, or the flood had swept him away? What if she was alone in this house 15 miles from help with a storm that showed no mercy and no end? 20 minutes. She couldn't stand it anymore. Maylene grabbed Ward's spare coat from the hook by the door, wrapped her shawl over her head, and plunged into the storm. The violence of it stole her breath. Rain struck her face like thrown gravel, wind tried to rip the coat from her shoulders, and the darkness was absolute except when lightning turned the world briefly white. She could barely see the barn, could barely stay on her feet against the wind's shoving, but she staggered forward toward where Ward's lantern had disappeared. She found him in the barn, trying to calm the horses who were in a complete panic. Part of the roof had collapsed, rain pouring through the gap, and the animals were trying to kick their way out of their stalls in terror. "What the hell are you doing here?" Ward shouted over the storm's roar, but his eyes showed relief beneath the anger. "I told you to stay in the house. You've been gone 20 minutes, Maylene had to scream to be heard. "I thought you were dead." "I'm trying to keep the horses from killing themselves." Ward was wrestling with a stall door, the terrified gelding inside throwing its weight against the wood hard enough to crack boards. "Help me get them into the center aisle away from the collapse." Together, fighting the panicked animals and the storm's fury, they managed to move all 4 horses away from the damaged section. The work was brutal and dangerous. Hooves flashed past Maylene's head more than once, and she took an elbow to the ribs from a thrashing mare that left her breathless with pain. But finally, the horses were secured in the safest part of the barn, still frightened but no longer in immediate danger. Ward checked the roof collapse, his face grim in the lantern light. "It's not going to spread. The main structure is solid." He turned to Maylene, taking in her soaked state, the way she was holding her ribs. "You're hurt." "I'm fine." The lie was obvious from the way she winced, but Maylene refused to acknowledge weakness. "Can the horses stay here safely?" "They'll have to. Moving them in this storm would be more dangerous than leaving them." Ward grabbed her arm, not roughly, but firmly enough that she couldn't pull away, and steered her toward the barn door. "We're going back to the house. Now." The return journey was somehow worse than the trip out. The storm had reached a crescendo of violence that seemed impossible. Wind strong enough that Ward had to wrap an arm around Maylene to keep her from being blown off her feet. They staggered through water that was ankle-deep and rising, through darkness broken by lightning that seared after-images into Maylene's vision. They fell through the door together, landing in a heap on the floor, both gasping for breath. Ward kicked the door shut and locked it, then turned to Maylene with an expression caught between fury and concern. "Don't ever do that again," he said, his voice rough. "Don't ever risk yourself like that for horses or property or anything else. Do you understand me?" Maylene struggled to sit up, her ribs screaming in protest. "You risked yourself. That's different. This is my ranch, my responsibility, and I work here. Those are my responsibilities too." Maylene met his eyes, her own blazing with an anger that matched his. "You don't get to decide I'm worth less than you just because you're the owner and I'm the employee. That's not—" Ward stopped, his jaw working. "I'm not saying you're worth less. I'm saying you matter, and I don't want you getting hurt for things that can be replaced. The horses can't be replaced, and neither can you." The words came out before Maylene could stop them, raw and honest in a way that stripped away all her careful distance. "You were gone 20 minutes, and I—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence without revealing too much. Ward was staring at her, water dripping from his hair, his expression shifting from anger to something else entirely. Something that made Maylene's heart hammer against her ribs harder than the pain from the mare's blow. "You were worried about me," he said quietly. "Of course I was worried about you." Maylene forced herself to stand, forced her voice to steadiness. "You're my employer. If something happened to you, I'd be stranded here alone with no—" "Maylene!" Her name on his lips stopped her mid-sentence. He stood too, moving closer, his winter sky eyes searching her face with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Is that really the only reason?" The question hung between them like the storm's lightning, bright and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Maylene could lie, should retreat behind the safe walls of employer and employee, should preserve the careful distance that kept her protected. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending she didn't notice the way her heart lifted when Ward came in from working, didn't care about his opinion on things that had nothing to do with housekeeping, didn't look forward to their evening conversations with an intensity that frightened her. "No," she whispered. "That's not the only reason." Ward's hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his weathered rancher's calluses. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he said, his voice low and rough. "For weeks now. The way you laugh at Miguel's terrible jokes. The way you attack dirt like it personally insulted you. The way you look in the morning light when you're making coffee and don't know I'm watching." Maylene's breath caught. "Caleb, I know I shouldn't feel this way. You're my employee, you're dependent on me. The power between us is all wrong." Ward's thumb traced her cheekbone, his touch feather light. "But I can't seem to help it. And if you tell me to stop, I will. I'll never mention it again and we'll go back to the way things were." Every rational thought in Maylene's mind screamed at her to do exactly that, to step back, to reinforce the boundaries, to protect herself from the vulnerability that came with caring for someone who held so much power over her survival. But her heart, her treacherous, foolish heart, wanted something different. "I don't want you to stop," she heard herself say. "But I can't. We can't. I'm not free, Caleb. I owe $2,000 still. I'm trapped in that debt, and anything between us would be built on that imbalance. You're my employer. You control my wages, my housing, my future. How could I ever know if my feelings were real or just survival instinct? How could you know if mine were?" The pain in Ward's eyes told her he'd already thought of this, had wrestled with the same questions. "So what do we do?" "We wait." Maylene forced herself to step back, to break the contact that made thinking impossible. I need to pay off the debt first. All of it. I need to be free before I can choose anything for myself. Do you understand? I understand. Ward's hand dropped to his side, and the loss of his touch felt like cold wind. But Maylene, at $75 a month minus the debt payment, you're still only saving maybe $20 monthly. It'll take you years. Then it takes years. Maylene wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together against the storm of emotions threatening to break her apart. I won't be anyone's charity case. I won't be anyone's kept woman. I won't be with you because I'm dependent on you for survival. When I come to you, if I come to you, it will be as an equal, or not at all. The silence between them was heavy with everything unsaid, everything wanted and denied. Outside, the storm raged on, wind howling its frustration in harmony with Maylin's own trapped feelings. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Ward said finally, and despite the seriousness of the moment, there was admiration in his voice. My father used to say the same thing. Maylene managed a small, pained smile. Usually right before he gave in to whatever I wanted. I'm not giving in. I'm agreeing to wait. Ward moved toward the stairs, then paused. But Maylene, when you're free of that debt, when you're standing on your own 2 feet with nothing owed to anyone, I'm going to ask you properly, and I hope to heaven you'll say yes. He left her standing in the kitchen, shaking from cold and emotion in equal measure. Maylene listened to his footsteps on the stairs, the sound of his bedroom door closing, and then she was alone with the storm and her own churning thoughts. She'd just turned down the possibility of something real with a man she was rapidly falling in love with. She'd chosen years more of grinding work in isolation and careful distance over the easier path of simply accepting what he was offering. But she'd also chosen dignity, chosen to make sure that if she gave herself to anyone, it would be a gift freely given, not a transaction born of desperation or dependence. Her ribs throbbed where the mare had struck her, a physical pain to match the emotional ache in her chest. Maylene climbed the stairs slowly, locked herself in her room, and changed into dry nightclothes with hands that trembled. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the violence giving way to steady rain and then to silence. Maylene had barely slept, lying awake listening to the water on the roof and replaying Ward's words, his touch, the look in his eyes when she'd told him they had to wait. She rose at 4:30 as always, forcing her exhausted body through the familiar routine. By the time Ward came downstairs, coffee was ready and breakfast was cooking, and Maylene had armored herself in professional courtesy. Morning, Ward said carefully, his eyes searching her face. Good morning. Maylene flipped bacon with steady hands. The storm did significant damage to the barn roof. Should I add lumber to the supply list for your next trip to town? Ward accepted the shift back to business without protest. I'll assess the damage after breakfast. Thomas and Miguel should be back this morning if the creek didn't wash out the bridge. They ate in silence, but it was different now, charged with awareness, heavy with things deliberately unsaid. Every accidental brush of hands passing the coffee pot felt electric. Every glance that lasted a second too long carried weight. This was going to be excruciating. Thomas and Miguel arrived mid-morning, soaked and exhausted but unharmed. They'd weathered the storm in the North Line shack, and their relief at finding the house and barn still standing was palpable. Over lunch, they described trees down across the North Road, cattle scattered but mostly accounted for, and the creek running high enough to be dangerous but not quite flooding. We were lucky, Thomas said, his weathered face serious. Storm like that could have destroyed everything. It tried, Ward said grimly. We'll need a week just to repair the immediate damage, longer to assess everything else. The next days fell into a brutal pattern of work. Ward, Thomas, and Miguel spent dawn to dusk repairing fences, clearing fallen trees, rounding up scattered cattle, and patching the barn roof. Maylene kept the house running, cooking massive meals to fuel the exhausted men, tending the scraped knuckles and bruised bodies that came from working with damaged wood and frightened animals, maintaining the clean order she'd worked so hard to establish. And through it all, she and Ward danced around each other with exquisite care. He was unfailingly polite, respectful, distant in a way that hurt more than anger would have. She was professional, efficient, friendly enough to avoid awkwardness, but careful never to be alone with him for more than necessary. It was exactly what she'd asked for, and it was killing her by inches. 3 weeks after the storm, Ward rode to town and returned with her debt receipt and something else, A letter from Rosie and a small wrapped package. Rosie says the saloon's not the same without you, Ward said, handing over the items. Asked me to make sure you're eating enough and not working yourself to death out here. Tell her I'm fine. Maylene took the package, recognizing Rosie's bold handwriting on the paper. Better than fine. Are you? Ward's voice was quiet, his eyes too knowing. Fine, I mean. Maylene met his gaze, saw the same carefully controlled longing she felt reflected in winter sky depths, and couldn't find it in herself to lie. I'm doing what needs to be done. That's enough. Is it? It has to be. Ward nodded slowly, accepting this non-answer because he had no choice. The debt's down to $1,843 now. You're making real progress. Real progress. At this rate, just over 2 more years of this careful distance, this deliberate denial, this slow torture of wanting something she'd forced herself to refuse. 2 years suddenly felt like eternity. That night, Maylene opened Rosie's package to find cookies, hand salve, and a letter that made her throat tight with unshed tears. You're too smart to settle for less than you deserve, Rosie had written. But don't be so smart you miss out on something good while you're busy protecting yourself. Sometimes the risk is worth taking. Maylene folded the letter carefully and tucked it away with her mother's letters, then sat by her window watching moonlight paint the valley silver. Somewhere in the house below, Ward was probably sitting at the kitchen table with his evening coffee, alone with thoughts that mirrored her own. The distance between them was maintained, the boundaries clear, the propriety preserved, and they were both absolutely miserable. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in late October and blanketing the valley in white silence. Maylene had never experienced a real winter. Black Ridge's desert climate brought cold nights but rarely snow, and she found herself torn between wonder at the beauty and terror at the isolation it created. We're snowed in until spring, Ward explained one morning, watching her stare out at the transformed landscape. Can't get to town, can't get supplies we don't have. Everything we need for the next 4 months has to already be here. Are we prepared? I stocked up heavy before the first snow. We'll be fine. Ward pulled on his heavy coat, preparing to break trail to the barn. But it does mean you're truly stuck here now. No option to leave, even if you wanted to. Maylene heard the question underneath his words. I don't want to leave. Something in Ward's expression eased, though he tried to hide it. Good, because breaking in a new housekeeper in the middle of winter would be a nightmare. He was trying for levity, but the joke fell flat. They both knew her value went far beyond housekeeping now, and pretending otherwise felt hollow. The winter months were both easier and harder than the previous seasons. Easier because the work slowed. No cattle to move, no major repairs needed, just the daily routine of survival and maintenance. Harder because the isolation meant more time together, more opportunities for careful distance to slip, more moments when the awareness between them became almost unbearable. They developed new routines to cope. Ward took to reading after dinner, sitting by the fire with books from the small library his wife had collected. Maylene sewed or mended while he read, and sometimes he would read passages aloud, poetry, history, stories from distant places. It was domestic and comfortable and achingly intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical contact. On Christmas Eve, Maylene made a special dinner using hoarded supplies. Roast goose, sweet potatoes with brown sugar, apple pie from preserved fruit. She told herself it was just acknowledging the holiday, nothing more, but the care she took with the meal betrayed the lie. Ward noticed. He came to dinner wearing his best shirt, his hair freshly trimmed, and brought something wrapped in cloth from his room. I don't expect anything, Maylene said quickly, embarrassed she had nothing to give him in return. It's not a gift, it's a loan. Ward unwrapped the cloth to reveal a beautiful wooden box, hand-carved with intricate patterns. My wife made this. She was learning woodworking, said it calmed her mind. I thought you might use it for your letters and important papers. Maylene took the box with trembling hands, running her fingers over the careful carving. Caleb, this is too... It's been sitting empty for 3 years. Sarah would want it used. Ward's voice was steady, but his eyes held old pain and new hope in equal measure. And you should call me Caleb, at least when it's just us. Caleb, Maylene tested the name, felt it settle on her tongue like something both dangerous and right. Thank you for this and for everything you've done for me. You've done more for me than you know. Caleb, He was Caleb now in her mind. She couldn't go back. Met her eyes across the table. This house was a tomb before you came. Now it's a home again. They ate dinner in charged silence, both aware that something had shifted again, that the careful distance was eroding despite their best efforts. When Maylene stood to clear the dishes, Caleb stood too, helping her carry plates to the kitchen. Their hands touched, reaching for the same cup, and the contact sent electricity through Maylene's entire body. She froze, cup suspended between them, unable to pull away. Maylene. Caleb's voice was rough, strained. How much longer? She knew what he was asking. How much longer until the debt was paid? How much longer could they maintain this facade of indifference? How much longer before something broke? 18 months, she whispered. Maybe less if I can take on extra work. Save more each month. 18 months. Caleb finally released the cup, stepped back, ran a hand through his hair in frustration. I can wait 18 months. I've waited 3 years already. I can wait 18 more months. But Maylene, when that debt is paid, when you're free, I know. She did know. Could feel the promise hanging between them like the future crystallizing into something real and possible and terrifying. When I'm free, we'll talk, really talk, about what this is and what it could be. That's all I'm asking. Caleb moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Merry Christmas, Maylene. Merry Christmas, Caleb. After he left, Maylene finished the dishes alone, then carried Sarah's beautiful carved box upstairs. She filled it carefully. Her mother's letters, Rosie's letters, her debt receipts showing the slowly shrinking balance, her contract, her jade bracelet, her father's watch, all the pieces of who she'd been and who she was becoming. 18 months. It felt simultaneously like forever and not nearly long enough to prepare for what might come after. Winter gave way to spring with the slow reluctance of something precious being surrendered. The snow melted in stages, revealing brown grass that gradually transformed to green, and with the thaw came the ability to reach town again. Caleb made the first trip in late March, returning with supplies and mail, and the news that Black Ridge was growing. New businesses, new people, new opportunities that meant nothing to Maylene because her life was here now, rooted in this valley as deeply as the cottonwoods by the creek. He also brought her debt receipt, $1,218 remaining. You're more than halfway there, he said, setting the paper on the kitchen table where she was rolling out pie dough. Another year, maybe less. Maylene's hand stilled on the rolling pin. A year. 12 more months of this careful dance, this deliberate distance that was growing harder to maintain with each passing day. That assumes nothing goes wrong. No injuries, no lost work, no emergencies. Then we make sure nothing goes wrong. Caleb's voice carried a determination that made her look up. What do you need? Better equipment? Different supplies? Tell me what would make the work easier, and I'll get it. I don't need anything easier. I need... Maylene stopped, the truth catching in her throat. What she needed wasn't equipment or supplies. What she needed was standing 3 feet away looking at her with winter sky eyes that saw too much, wanted too much, promised too much. What do you need? Caleb asked quietly. Time, she said finally. Just time. Spring brought back the full rhythm of ranch work. Cattle to move, fences to repair after winter damage, fields to prepare. Thomas and Miguel returned from wherever they'd spent the winter months, and the house filled again with the sounds of men's voices, boots on the porch, the organized chaos of a working ranch. Maylene threw herself into the work with renewed intensity, as if staying busy enough could quiet the restless wanting that had taken root in her chest. She planted a kitchen garden with seeds Caleb brought from town, tended it with the same fierce attention she gave everything else, watched green shoots push through dark soil, and felt an unreasonable pride at this small creation, this proof that she could make things grow in this harsh land. You've got a gift for this, Miguel observed one afternoon, watching her carefully thin the carrot seedlings. Mi abuela, she say you can tell a person's heart by how they tend growing things. Gentle hands, patient heart. Or stubborn hands and a control problem, Maylene countered, but she smiled as she said it. That too, maybe. Miguel grinned. But the plants, they don't care why. They just grow. The garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that transformed their meals from sustaining to genuinely good. Caleb praised the food with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive until Maylene realized he was starved not just for good cooking but for the care it represented. The proof that someone was paying attention to his preferences, his comfort, his life. It made her chest ache in ways she couldn't afford to examine. In May, a letter arrived from Rosie that changed everything. Maylene was alone in the kitchen when Caleb returned from town, and she saw immediately that something was wrong. His face was tight, his movements careful in the way of someone controlling anger. What happened? She set down the bread dough she was kneading. "Thornton's selling your father's debts." Caleb's voice was flat, too controlled. "Consolidating his holdings," he claims. "Your debt is being transferred to Marcus Webb." The name meant nothing to Maylene. Who is Marcus Webb? A speculator from Denver, buys up debt notes at discount and then squeezes the debtors for full payment plus interest. Caleb's jaw was tight enough that muscles jumped beneath his skin. He's also got a reputation for offering to forgive debts in exchange for other considerations, particularly from women who owe him money. Understanding hit like a fist to the stomach. When does the transfer happen? It already has. Thornton sold it 2 weeks ago. Webb's been asking around town about you, where you are, who you work for, whether you're married. Caleb met her eyes, and she saw fury banked there like coals. Rosie heard about it and sent word with me. She said to warn you that Webb's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer. Maylene's mind was racing, calculating. $1,200. She had maybe $200 saved beyond her monthly payments. Even if she gave Webb everything, she'd still owe $1,000. And men like Webb, men who made those kinds of offers to desperate women, didn't accept partial payment when they could leverage the remainder for something else. "I need to pay it off," she said. "All of it. Now." "You don't have—" "Then I need to find a way to get it." Maylene's voice was sharp with building panic. "I can't let this man have power over me. I can't be in debt to someone who would—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I'll lend you the money." Caleb said it immediately, without hesitation. $1,200. Interest-free. Pay me back on whatever terms you want. "No." The refusal was automatic, visceral. "I won't trade Thornton's debt for yours. I won't owe you money when we—" She stopped, but the unfinished thought hung between them anyway. "When we're trying to figure out what this thing between us is." "Then what?" Caleb's frustration was leaking through his careful control. "You can't run from this, Maylene. Webb's going to come here. He's going to make his offer, and you're going to be exactly where you were in Black Ridge, trapped with no good options." Maylene turned away from him, staring out the kitchen window at the garden she'd planted, the valleys she'd come to love, the life she'd built from nothing. She'd been so careful, so disciplined, saving every spare dollar, paying down the debt month by month. And now some stranger from Denver was going to show up and destroy everything she'd fought for. Unless she fought back. "I need to think," she said. "Give me tonight to think." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. "Tonight? But Maylene, Webb could be here any day. We don't have long to figure this out." She barely slept that night, her mind turning over options and finding each one worse than the last. She could run, take her savings and disappear into some other town, start over under a different name. But debt had a way of following people, and she'd be looking over her shoulder forever. She could accept Caleb's loan, but that would put her right back in a position of dependence, of owing her survival to a man's generosity, and everything in her rebelled against it. She could face Webb and try to negotiate terms she could live with, but men like him didn't negotiate with women who had no leverage. Or she could do something so radical, so desperate, that even thinking it made her heart hammer with fear and possibility in equal measure. When dawn broke, Maylene had made her decision. She found Caleb in his barn, feeding the horses. He looked up when she entered, his face haggard with lack of sleep. "I have a proposition," Maylene said without preamble, "and I need you to listen to all of it before you answer." Caleb set down the feed bucket, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening." "Marry me." The words came out steady despite the terror singing through her veins. "Not for love, not for anything romantic. A business arrangement. You pay off my debt to Webb as a wedding gift, and in exchange I continue working here as your wife instead of your housekeeper. Same work, different title. You get someone to manage your household permanently. I get freedom from debt and legal protection from men like Webb who can't make offers to married women. Caleb stared at her, his expression unreadable. A business arrangement. Yes, with clear terms. Separate bedrooms. No expectations beyond what we already have. I manage the house, you manage the ranch. After 2 years, if either of us wants out, we can dissolve the marriage quietly and part ways. Maylene forced herself to hold his gaze, to not flinch from what she was proposing. I know it's not what you wanted. I know you were hoping for something real when the debt was paid. But this way, I'm free immediately, and you're not stuck waiting for something that might never stop. Caleb's voice cut through her speech like a blade. Just stop. Maylene braced herself for rejection, for the anger she deserved for proposing something so coldly transactional when they both knew what actually lay between them. But Caleb surprised her. You really think I'd agree to marry you as a business arrangement? His voice was rough with emotion she couldn't identify. You think I could live in the same house with you, share meals with you, watch you in my kitchen every morning, and keep it strictly business? I think we've been doing exactly that for months, Maylene said quietly. I think we're both better at distance than we want to admit. We're terrible at distance. Caleb closed the space between them in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her breath catch. We're absolutely terrible at it, and you know it. Every time I try to stay away from you, I find myself in whatever room you're in. Every time I tell myself to stop caring so much, you do something that makes my chest hurt with how much I want this, want you, want us. Caleb, her voice broke on his name. Here's my counteroffer. His thumbs stroked her cheekbones, his eyes boring into hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. I'll marry you. I'll pay off the debt. But not as a business arrangement. As a real marriage. Not immediately, he added quickly, seeing panic flash in her eyes. I understand you need to feel equal first. So we get married now for legal protection, I pay the debt, and then we live as we have been. Separate rooms, no expectations, until you're ready. A month, 6 months, a year, 10 years. However long it takes for you to believe that I want you as my partner, not my obligation. Maylene felt tears burning behind her eyes. That's not fair to you. Let me decide what's fair to me. Caleb's voice was fierce, protective. You've spent your whole life letting other people decide what you're worth, what you deserve, what you should accept. I'm asking you to let me decide that marrying you, even with conditions, even with waiting, is exactly what I want. Can you do that? Could she? Could she take this leap, this terrifying risk of binding herself legally to a man before she felt equal to him? Could she trust that Caleb's feelings were real and would last, that this wasn't just loneliness or convenience dressed up as something more? I'm afraid, she whispered. I'm afraid you'll wake up one day and realize you could have had someone better, someone from town, someone without debt and history and all my sharp edges. I don't want someone from town. I want you, sharp edges and all. Caleb's smile was small but real. Maylene, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You took impossible circumstances and fought your way through them with nothing but discipline and stubbornness. You transformed my house from a tomb into a home. You made me remember what it feels like to want to come inside at the end of the day instead of avoiding it. How could anyone be better than that? The tears spilled over, tracking hot down her cheeks. What if I can't be a proper wife? What if I don't know how? Then we'll figure it out together. Caleb wiped away her tears with his thumbs, his touch infinitely gentle. We're both broken in our own ways, both scarred by what we've lost. But maybe that means we understand each other better than whole people could. Maybe broken together is stronger than perfect alone. Maylene looked up at this man who had offered her a job when she was desperate, who had treated her with respect when the world saw her as disposable, who was now offering her not just freedom from debt, but partnership, protection, something that terrified her with its potential for both joy and devastating loss. And she realized that the real risk wasn't in saying yes. The real risk was in saying no and spending the rest of her life wondering what they could have built together. Okay, she breathed. Yes, I'll marry you. Caleb's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, brilliant and transformative. He pulled her into his arms, and Maylene let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself feel safe and wanted and valued. "We should do it soon," Caleb said into her hair, "before Webb shows up making trouble." "How soon?" "Tomorrow. I'll ride to town today, talk to the minister, get the license. We can marry tomorrow afternoon and have it done before Webb even knows it happened." The speed of it made Maylene's head spin, but she understood the logic. Once they were married, her debt became Caleb's legal responsibility, and Webb would have no leverage over her. "All right, tomorrow." They pulled apart reluctantly, and Maylene saw her own mixture of hope and fear reflected in Caleb's eyes. This was happening. This was real. In 24 hours, she would be someone's wife, legally bound in a way that both protected and terrified her. "I should warn you," Caleb said, gathering her hands in his. "Marrying me means you're stuck with Thomas and Miguel as permanent fixtures. They come with the ranch." "I like Thomas and Miguel." "You say that now. Wait until you've been tripping over them for years." He squeezed her hands gently. "Any other concerns, things we should discuss before we make this permanent?" Maylene thought carefully. "Children. What if I can't have them, or don't want them yet?" Caleb's face shadowed briefly with old grief. "I lost a child already. I won't rush into that again. If we decide we want children someday, we'll talk about it then. And if we don't, that's fine too. I'm marrying you, not for hypothetical children." The knot in Maylene's chest loosened slightly. "And if this doesn't work, if we try and can't make each other happy, then we'll face that if it happens." "But Maylene, I've been alone with my ghosts for 3 years. Even friendship with you would be better than that. And I think we might manage more than friendship." His smile turned wry. "Call it cautious optimism from a man who's seen you attack dirt like it killed your family." Despite everything, Maylene laughed, a small, shaky sound that released some of the tension coiled in her chest. "I do hate dirt. I've noticed. My house has never been cleaner." Caleb raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her scarred knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch. "I'll take care of everything today. You just be ready tomorrow. I don't have anything to wear to a wedding. Wear whatever makes you happy. You could marry me in your work dress, and I wouldn't care." He paused at the barn door. "But there's something in Sarah's trunk upstairs, a dress she never got to wear. She'd bought it for our first anniversary before she died. If you want to look at it, you're welcome to. She was about your size." The offer was generous and painful in equal measure, Caleb's dead wife's dress for his new wife's wedding. But Maylene understood what he was offering, not a replacement but a connection, a way to honor what was while embracing what could be. "I'll look at it," she said quietly. "Thank you." Caleb left for town an hour later, and Maylene climbed the stairs to the room that had been his wife's domain. She'd cleaned this room like all the others, but she'd never opened the trunk at the foot of the bed, never presumed that right. Now she lifted the lid with careful hands and found it packed with things too precious to use but too meaningful to discard. A shawl, a pair of good gloves, a cameo brooch, and beneath it all, wrapped in tissue paper, a dress of deep blue silk. Maylene lifted it out with trembling hands. It was beautiful, simple lines but expensive fabric, the kind of dress a ranch wife might wear to town on special occasions. She held it up to herself, checking the length, and found it would fit almost perfectly. Sarah Ward had been 20 when she died. She'd been learning to cook, learning ranch life, trying to make a home with the man she'd married young. And she'd died before getting the chance to see if any of it would work. Maylene folded the dress carefully and carried it to her own room. She would wear it tomorrow, not to replace Sarah, but to honor her, to acknowledge that she was stepping into a space that grief had carved out and that perhaps, eventually, something new could grow there. That night at dinner, Thomas and Miguel noticed the tension immediately. "Something happened in town?" Thomas asked, his weathered face concerned. "Not yet," Caleb said, "but something's about to happen here. Maylene and I are getting married tomorrow." The silence that followed was profound. Miguel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Thomas's coffee cup froze in midair. "Well," Thomas said finally, setting down his cup with deliberate care, "it's about damn time." Miguel broke into a broad grin. "We thought maybe you were both blind. Months watching you two dance around each other like nervous horses." Heat flooded Maylene's cheeks. "You knew?" "Everyone knew, Senorita Maylene. Everyone but maybe you two." Miguel's eyes were warm with genuine happiness. This is good news, very good news. It's sudden, Caleb warned. There are circumstances that make the timing necessary, but it's real. I want that clear. Thomas nodded slowly, his sharp eyes moving between them. You need witnesses tomorrow? If you're willing, be honored to stand up for you both. Thomas raised his coffee cup in a toast. To the new Mrs. Ward, may she continue making food this good for many years to come. They drank to that, and Maylene felt something warm unfurl in her chest. These men, rough around the edges but kind at heart, were accepting her not as the Chinese housekeeper but as Caleb's wife, as someone who belonged here. It was more than Blackridge had ever offered, more than she dared hope for. That night, Maylene lay awake again, but this time it wasn't fear keeping her conscious. It was anticipation, nervous excitement, the strange sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't fully predict but might possibly be ready for. Tomorrow she would become Maylene Ward. Tomorrow her father's debts would be erased, the weight she'd carried for nearly 2 years finally lifted. Tomorrow she would stand beside Caleb and promise things she wasn't entirely sure she could deliver but was willing to try. Tomorrow she would gamble everything on the hope that broken together might indeed be stronger than perfect alone. Caleb returned late the next morning with the minister, a kindly older man named Reverend Mitchell, who asked no uncomfortable questions and seemed genuinely pleased to be performing a wedding ceremony. I'll need a few minutes with the bride and groom separately, he said, settling into the parlor. Standard pre-wedding counsel. Maylene met with him first, her hands twisted together in her lap, while the Reverend asked gentle questions about her faith, her understanding of marriage, her commitment to the vows she was about to make. I won't lie to you, Maylene said finally. This marriage is partly practical. I'm in debt, and there's a man coming who might try to take advantage of that. Marrying Caleb protects me legally. Reverend Mitchell studied her with sharp but kind eyes. And the other part? The part that isn't practical? Maylene looked out the window at Caleb, who was standing on the porch with Thomas and Miguel, his profile strong against the afternoon light. The other part terrifies me, because it's real. Because I care about him in ways I didn't plan on, in ways that make me vulnerable. And I don't know how to be vulnerable without getting destroyed. Then you learn together. The Reverend's voice was gentle. That's what marriage is, child. Two people learning to be vulnerable together, to trust that the other will handle their heart with care. It's not about perfection. It's about showing up day after day and choosing each other even when it's hard. And if I fail, if I can't be what he needs, then you talk about it, you adjust, you keep trying. The Reverend smiled. Marriage isn't a destination, Miss Chow. It's a journey you take together. The destination changes as you walk. When it was Caleb's turn, Maylene waited in the kitchen with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She wore Sarah's blue dress, and it fit like it had been made for her. A sign, maybe, or just good fortune. Her hair was pinned up carefully, her mother's jade bracelet on her wrist, her father's watch tucked in her pocket like a talisman. Ready? Caleb appeared in the doorway, cleaned up and wearing his best shirt, looking nervous and hopeful in equal measure. Ready, Maylene lied, and took his offered arm. They gathered in the parlor, Caleb and Maylene standing before the Reverend, Thomas and Miguel as witnesses, the late afternoon light streaming through the windows Maylene had scrubbed until they sparkled. It was simple, informal, nothing like the elaborate weddings in Blackridge where Maylene had been invisible help rather than honored guest. But it was theirs. The Reverend spoke about commitment and partnership, about choosing to build a life together despite uncertainty, about love as action rather than feeling. And then he asked them to speak their vows. Caleb went first, his voice steady despite the emotion visible in his eyes. I promise to respect you as my equal in all things, to value your opinion, your strength, your independence, to give you space when you need it and support when you ask for it, to wait as long as you need me to wait, and to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and our future. Then it was Maylene's turn. She looked up at this man who had offered her salvation when she was drowning, who had kept every promise he'd made, who was now binding himself to her with patience and hope that she wasn't sure she deserved. I promise to work beside you as partner, not just employee, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, to bring my full self to this marriage, even the parts that are scared and broken. To trust that you mean what you say, even when my past tells me not to trust anyone. To try, every day, to be worthy of the faith you're showing in me. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Mitchell smiled. "Mr. Ward, you may kiss your bride." Caleb looked at Maylene, a question in his eyes, giving her the choice. She nodded slightly, and he leaned down to press the gentlest kiss to her lips. Barely a touch. A promise of restraint and respect and all the things they'd agreed to. But even that brief contact sent warmth flooding through her, and when they pulled apart, Maylene saw the same awareness in Caleb's eyes. This was going to be harder than she'd thought. Thomas and Miguel cheered, breaking the tension, and suddenly Maylene was being congratulated and hugged and welcomed officially into a family she'd been part of for months without acknowledging it. "We should celebrate," Miguel announced. "Big dinner, yes?" "I can cook?" Maylene started, but Caleb shook his head. "Not tonight. Tonight you're the bride, not the cook. We'll manage something." They managed bread and cheese and preserved meat, eaten at the kitchen table while darkness fell outside and conversation flowed more easily than Maylene had expected. The men told stories about the ranch, about cattle drives and winter storms, and the time a mountain lion tried to steal a calf from the barn. They included Maylene naturally, asking her opinion, laughing at her observations, treating her as if she'd always belonged. And gradually, Maylene felt something loosen in her chest. These people, these rough, kind men, were her family now. This place was her home, and the man sitting beside her, whose arm brushed hers when he reached for the bread, was her husband. The word felt foreign and familiar at once, like trying on clothes that might someday fit perfectly, but needed adjustment first. When Thomas and Miguel finally left for the bunkhouse, Maylene and Caleb were left alone in the kitchen that had become their neutral territory over the past months. "So," Caleb said, "we're married." "We're married," Maylene confirmed. Awkward silence fell between them, charged with new significance. They'd been alone together countless times, but this was different. Now they were legally bound. Now expectations hovered in the air like unspoken questions. "I meant what I said," Caleb broke the silence gently. "Separate rooms. No pressure. We move forward, at whatever pace you need." Relief and disappointment warred in Maylene's chest. "Thank you. I know this isn't what most men would accept. I'm not most men, and you're not most women." Caleb stood, began gathering dishes. "I'll ride to town tomorrow, pay off Webb before he can show up here making trouble. Once that's done, you're completely free. Free from debt, free from men who think they can own you, free to decide what you want your life to be." Free! The words sang through Maylene's veins like wine, intoxicating and terrifying. After 2 years of crushing debt, of working herself to exhaustion, of being trapped by her father's mistakes, she would finally be free. And then what? She helped Caleb clean up, their hands touching occasionally in the soapy water, each contact electric with new meaning. When the last dish was dried and put away, they stood in the kitchen that had witnessed their careful dance, their growing feelings, their decision to bet everything on each other. "I should go to bed," Maylene said. "It's been a long day." "It has." Caleb reached out, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with infinite gentleness. "Good night, wife." The word sent shivers down her spine. "Good night, husband." She climbed the stairs to her room, locked the door from habit, then stared at the lock for a long moment before deliberately unlocking it again. She was married now. She was safe. She didn't need to lock out the man who'd just promised her protection and patience, but old habits died hard, and she locked it anyway. Caleb left at dawn for town, riding hard to reach Black Ridge and back in one day. Maylene kept herself busy with work, but her mind couldn't settle. What if Webb refused to accept payment? What if there were complications she hadn't foreseen? What if Caleb— She stopped that thought before it could form. Caleb had never broken a promise to her. He wouldn't start now. He returned at dusk, exhausted and covered in trail dust, but his face was triumphant. He dropped a receipt on the kitchen table, stamped "Paid in full" in bold letters, and Maylene's knees went weak. "It's done," Caleb said. Webb wasn't happy, but he couldn't refuse legal payment. "Your father's debt no longer exists." Malin picked up the receipt with shaking hands, staring at those three beautiful words. Paid in full. The weight that had crushed her for 2 years, that had driven her to work 3 brutal jobs, that had trapped her in Black Ridge's cruelty. Gone. Erased. Finished. She burst into tears. Caleb caught her as her legs gave out, held her while she sobbed against his chest. 2 years of fear and exhaustion and desperate hope finally released in a flood she couldn't control. He didn't try to stop her, didn't tell her not to cry, just held her steady and let her fall apart in the safety of his arms. When the storm finally passed, Maylene pulled back, wiping her eyes with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I don't usually—" "Don't apologize. You've earned those tears." Caleb's voice was rough with his own emotion. "You're free now, Maylene. Completely free. You can stay here, you can leave, you can do whatever you want. The choice is entirely yours." She looked up at him through tear-blurred vision, at this man who had given her everything she needed and asked for nothing in return except time and patience. And she realized with crystalline clarity that she'd already made her choice months ago, maybe even that first night in the saloon when he'd offered her an impossible job and she'd been brave enough to take it. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you. I choose us. You're sure? You don't need more time to—" Maylene stood on her toes and kissed him, cutting off his words, pouring into that kiss all the feelings she'd been holding back for months. Caleb froze for a heartbeat, then his arms came around her and he kissed her back with a hunger that had been banked for too long, a wanting that matched her own. They broke apart gasping, foreheads pressed together, the air between them charged with possibility. "I'm sure," Maylene whispered. "I'm terrified and completely unsure of what I'm doing, but I'm sure about this. About you." Caleb's smile was brilliant, transformative. "Then we'll figure out the rest together." And they did. Not perfectly, not without stumbles and fears and moments of doubt, but together, day by day, they built something neither had thought possible. A partnership forged in respect and strengthened by adversity. A love that grew from friendship and bloomed into something fierce and enduring. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Caleb's practical ranching knowledge paired with Maylene's sharp business sense created something more profitable than either could have managed alone. She started keeping the books, noticed inefficiencies, suggested changes that increased their margins. He listened, implemented her ideas, treated her input as valuable as any man's. Within 2 years, they'd expanded the herd, bought adjacent land, built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. The ranch hands multiplied as the operation grew, and Maylene found herself managing not just a household, but an enterprise. Her opinions sought on everything from which bulls to buy to where to drill the new well. In town, opinions shifted slowly. Some people never forgave her for being Chinese, never stopped whispering about the rancher who'd married his housekeeper. But others, especially the women who'd been watching quietly, began to nod respectfully when she passed, to ask her advice on household matters, to acknowledge that Maylin Ward was a force to be reckoned with. Rosie came to visit that first summer, riding out in a hired wagon just to see for herself that Maylene was truly happy. She found her friend transformed, still hardworking, still fierce, but no longer haunted by the desperate exhaustion that had clung to her in Black Ridge. "You look good, girl," Rosie said, pulling Maylene into a crushing hug. "Real good. Happy." "I am happy," Maylene said, and realized with some surprise that it was completely true. Terrified sometimes, still figuring things out, but happy. "That ward treating you right? Better than I deserve. Better than I knew how to accept at first." Maylene looked across the yard at Caleb, who was showing Rosie's driver where to water the horses. "He's patient with me, even when I'm difficult." "You're always difficult. It's your best quality." Rosie squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you. You took an impossible situation and made it work through pure stubborn refusal to quit." Children came eventually, though not easily. 2 miscarriages taught them both the bitter lesson of hope deferred before a daughter arrived, red-faced and screaming, on a spring morning that felt like the world beginning anew. They named her Sarah May, honoring both the past and the present. Caleb wept when he held her, tears of joy and grief tangled together. "Thank you," he whispered to Maylene, who was exhausted but radiant. "Thank you for giving me this, for taking the risk with me." "We took the risk together," Maylene corrected, watching her husband cradle their daughter with infinite gentleness. "Everything we've built, we built together." More children followed, a son they named Wei for Maylene's father. Another daughter they called Rose for the friend who'd shown Maylene kindness when she needed it most. The house that had been a tomb became filled with noise and life, and the beautiful chaos of a family growing into itself. Maylene taught her children 3 languages: English for the world they lived in, Spanish from Miguel, who became their honorary uncle, and Chinese so they would know where half their heritage came from. She taught them her father's values: honesty, education, honor, and Caleb's ranching skills. She made sure her daughters knew they were as capable as any son, that their opinions mattered, that the world might try to limit them, but they should never limit themselves. And she taught all of them what she'd learned the hard way: that dignity couldn't be taken, only surrendered. That debt was expensive, but freedom was priceless. That the hardest choices sometimes led to the best outcomes. Years passed, measured in seasons and storms, in cattle drives and harvest celebrations, in children growing and the ranch expanding. Thomas and Miguel grew old in service to the Double Bar W, training new hands who learned quickly that Mrs. Ward's standards were exacting and her praise hard-won but worth earning. On their 10th anniversary, Caleb gave Maylene a new carved box, this one made by his own hands, decorated with patterns that told their story. A lone woman walking through desert, a ranch house on a hill, 2 figures standing together against a storm, children playing in a garden. "To remember how far we've come," he said, placing it in her hands. Maylene traced the carvings with fingers that still bore the scars of lye soap and hard labor, marks she'd stopped being ashamed of long ago. They were proof of survival, of strength, of the price she'd paid to build this life. "I never thanked you properly," she said, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for offering me a chance when I had nothing, for being patient when I was too scared to accept what you were offering. You thanked me every day by choosing to stay, by building this with me." Caleb pulled her into his arms, and they stood together in the house that was finally fully home. "Besides, I got the better end of the bargain. A wife who can outwork any man, who makes the best apple pie in the territory, who turned my disaster of a house into something beautiful." "Sweet talker," Maylene accused, but she smiled against his chest. "Just honest." He kissed the top of her head. "Always honest with you." And he had been. Through everything, through fear and doubt, through loss and triumph, through the slow building of trust that became the foundation of love. Caleb had been honest, patient, steady as the mountains that ringed their valley. They had gambled on each other when the odds were terrible and the risks were high, and they had won something precious, a partnership built on mutual respect, a family forged from 2 people broken in different ways, a legacy that would outlast them both. The Chinese woman who had arrived in Blackridge with nothing but debt and desperation was gone, transformed into Maylene Ward, rancher, mother, businesswoman, the heart of an empire built on harsh land that had tried to break her and failed. She'd survived. More than survived, she'd triumphed. And when she stood on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over land that was hers in ways that had nothing to do with legal ownership and everything to do with blood, sweat, and stubborn refusal to quit, she felt something that had been absent for most of her life: peace. She had earned every inch of this life, had paid for it with destroyed hands and sleepless nights, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that tested whether she was strong enough to deserve survival. She had been strong enough, and in proving that to herself, she had discovered something even more valuable than freedom from debt. She had discovered that she was capable of building something beautiful from absolutely nothing, that love could grow in the harshest soil if tended with care, that the courage to risk everything on hope was the most terrifying and worthwhile gamble of all. The mail-order bride who never was. The housekeeper who became so much more. The daughter of a dreamer who learned to build her own dreams on foundations of discipline, intelligence, and sheer stubborn will. This was her story. This was her triumph. And it was complete.